Welcome. This is the Glendale Historic Preservation Commission meeting of Thursday, September 21st, 2017, and the time is 5:03. May we please have roll call?
Here. Here.
Here.
Here.
Here.
Great, thank you. Number 2 on the agenda is the posting of the agenda. So this agenda was posted on or before Monday, September 18th, 2017 on the bulletin board outside of City Hall. Number 3, approval of the minutes from August 17th, 2017. Are there any comments or corrections?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Catherine Yurka's name is misspelled on 4 oral communications and on 7, I believe it is. Yes, and 7, new business.
Okay.
There's no K, it's a C.
Oh, you are correct.
Of course.
So 4 and 7, yeah, 7A.
Good eye.
And then under, new business F, 1122 Rossmoyne Avenue. For the motion, I think it should read on the second line, the Historic Preservation Commission recommends to the City Council that the property at 1122 Rossmoyne Avenue not be designated. Not that it not recommend that it not be designated.
You're correct.
Thank
Oh,
you.
that's a double negative.
It is.
Uh-oh.
Scary. Do we need to add Mills Act as well? Because
I think it's fine, but we may as well amend it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other comments or corrections? Oh, there's another Catherine Yurka, 8A.
I missed 8A?
I think that was some cutting and pasting going on there.
Yeah.
So it's with C. Okay.
I think she noticed because she's not here tonight.
That's right.
She's very offended.
Offended. We apologize. It was...
Okay, is there a motion to approve the minutes with corrections?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Yes.
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 Yes. Okay, item 4 is oral communications. Discussion will be limited to items not part of today's agenda. The speaker is limited to 5 minutes. The commission may question the speaker, but there will be no debate or decision. So with that, we have one speaker card, Greg Grammer.
Good evening, Chair Shire and members of the Historic Preservation Commission. Just wanted to let everyone know here in the room and everyone watching at home that tickets are still on sale for our California Craftsman, Glendale's Vanishing Heritage Home Tour on September 24th. It is an architectural tour of 5 houses built between 1902 and 1915 that illustrate the variety and evolution of the Craftsman style. We have 5 fantastic houses, including 2 houses that are on the Glendale Register. We also have the Dora Verdugo house, which has been undergoing a restoration by the current owners. Tickets and information can be found at our website at www.glendalehistorical.org, and I hope to see you all there. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, with no other oral communications, number 5, comments from commissioners. Any comments?
We just have one small thing. This last Monday, unfortunately, I couldn't come to Raising the Bar. I wished I could have been, but the Historical Society of the Crescenta Valley had Lieutenant Colonel Robert Friend. He's one of the last 19 of the Tuskegee pilots surviving, and he gave a talk at the Historical Society of the Crescenta Valley. It was very interesting. It was well attended, and I hope if you get a chance, the gentleman is 94 years of age, so there's not going to be a lot of chances afterwards, but his recreation of World War II, after World War II, the gentleman was in World War II, he was in Korea, and he was also in Vietnam, so we had a long, extensive record as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. So if you get a chance, his name is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Friend. It's well worth going out of your way to hear him speak. That's it.
Thank you.
And I, too, just wanted to encourage everybody to join in the annual home tour this weekend. I will be volunteering at that event, and I look forward to it, and I thank the Glendale Historical Society for their efforts. Should be another good tour.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm good.
Anyone else? Okay, with that, number 6, old business, and we have none. So for 7, new business. A is the review of the preliminary draft of the South Glendale Historic Resources Survey and timeline for the commission and public comment.
And before I start that, I just wanted to let the commission and anyone else in the audience know that we have some strangers to us sitting among our group. They're students in the Heritage Conservation Program at USC, fulfilling the requirements of a very important assignment that they must do very well on. So I just want to let you know why some people are here who might not be speaking tonight. So.
Great.
Well, welcome.
Welcome.
I hope you get an A.
She has no power over me in that way. Okay, so moving on to our first item, and one of the most important items we've ever had at the Historic Preservation Commission. Tonight marks the exciting beginning of our review period for the South Glendale Historic Resource Survey. It's been a long time coming, and we have gotten a lot of fantastic results out of this. Before I introduce our consultant who's going to present the survey and the basic structure of the survey, how we developed the methodology, and then some of the results that we've found through the survey, I just wanted to kind of talk about the timeline a little bit, how much public review there will be, and then stress that this is the preliminary hearing. So as much as I see some of you have marked up your papers and you've done review of this is going to be an ongoing process that will take us through the next several months. So the two things you should know is tonight's the public debut of this survey results in their preliminary draft form. This was supposed to be tied into the release of the draft of the Environmental Impact Report for the South Glendale Community Plan, which this is tied to. So if you remember a couple of years ago, the Commission reviewed the South Glendale Historic Context. That is also going to be part of the South Glendale Community Plan. The survey will then be kind of taking off from that context. It will also be part of the community plan. So all of this historic information is going to be memorialized as part of the community plan, which will then be used to guide development as we move forward for the next 10 to 20 years. And so that's a really important aspect of this, that this isn't just a standalone survey, but it's also part of a bigger planning document. So there's a real connection between these two things. In terms of your review tonight and your ongoing review, we're going to be taking notes and whatever paperwork is submitted from any of the commissioners, any members of the public, from the Glendale Historical Society, and then as we move forward with the EIR process, it's also going to be going out to the broader community. So we're going to get as much input from everyone into this process. All of that input at this point will be taken and reviewed by our consultant. The consultant is ultimately going to be the last word on what is a historic resource, what isn't a historic resource, and what status codes will be assigned. We released the preliminary draft earlier to the Glendale Historical Society to give them a head start to bring comments to tonight. And we'll continue taking comments. For example, they gave us kind of two sets of comments, one of which has been reviewed and incorporated where appropriate into the draft that you're reviewing. And the other one we haven't reviewed enough yet to incorporate. The main point I want to make is nothing is set in stone at this point. So this is a draft, it's in flux, it's going to change. It's going to be the best possible survey we can make it and reflect the heritage of Glendale and protect the heritage of Glendale to the highest level that we can within the confines of preservation practice and best practices. So in terms of the timeline, if we're now in September, we're going to bring this back agendized for the Commission at its October 21st hearing. At that point, I assume those of you who haven't had a chance to really dig into this will have more time to do that. Because the schedule for the EIR has been pushed back, or the draft EIR has been pushed back, that will probably even give us more time because there's going to be a 60-day review period for the EIR. And so I conceive that whatever hearing we have at the end of the year, whether it's the November hearing or one that sometimes we combine November and December, There'll still be time for more comments. So anytime we're agendizing it, obviously it's public comment. It's not just you talking. It's not just the Historical Society or the consultant or staff. It's whoever is interested in bringing their opinions and views to the table. So, and then finally, once the EIR is released publicly, and then we have that 60-day review period, all comments, whether it's on the historical things, and this is a huge document, many, many things that are completely outside of our realm will be reviewed. Once all of those comments are in by the end of that comment period, everything's compiled. We're going to have what I imagine will be a huge kind of response to the draft that then filters into the final EIR. The goal is to have the draft comment period done by the end of the year, unless Eric Krause wants to contradict that or suggest anything. That's the goal, but it's been a sliding kind of timeline. The final EIR would then be prepared sometime late winter, spring 2018.
The plan right now is the EIR has been slightly delayed, so it was supposed to come out in early October 3rd, I believe. So we're about 2 to 3 weeks behind right now on making sure the document satisfies CEQA. So once that comes out, there'll be a 60-day review period. The plan is to still take it to the City Council as part of the final sometime in mid-March for adoption of the plan and certification.
So at that point, the survey would also be finalized. We can present it to the public as the city's final document that will then guide property owners, developers, preservationists when they come to us and say, is this property historic anywhere in the South Glendale area? We'll be able to give them a definitive answer, where today we have not been able to do that, and it's been a real issue for us, for everyone. So that's the timeline. I kind of think we should just jump into the review of the document and then hear from everyone and hear from the commissioners. We put the we hired Historic Resources Group to do this document. They were the firm that did the context. It made sense to follow through on the context through to the survey. There are often documents that go hand in hand. Ideally, they're prepared more closely in time, but it didn't work out with the city's budget and schedule. So Historic Resources Group has been one of the leaders in preservation for decades in Los Angeles, and they were one of the key firms that was really instrumental in moving Survey LA forward. Survey LA was the largest historic resource survey in the nation's history, and HRG and pretty much all of the other preservation firms in the area worked at some level on this document. And what I think is we're the beneficiaries of everything that was learned through that process. I'm not sure if Christine will be addressing that, but I just want you to know the context that the ability to do survey in LA has been immensely, we're in a much better position than we ever were to kind of develop methodologies and do these detailed, big picture surveys than we were 15 or 20 years ago. So I think we're going to be grateful that HRG was able to work on this survey. So without further ado, I will introduce Christine Lazaretto. She's a principal with HRG. She was the project manager for the survey, and she has a presentation for you.
Thank you, Jay, and good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for having us here today. As Jay mentioned, I'm a principal at Historic Resources Group. We have been working on this survey for a while, but I also wanted to reiterate what Jay was saying, is that we are still at a preliminary phase. We're actually, I was going to ask how I do that. We are actually still doing internal vetting, but because of the EIR for the community plan, we wanted to get some findings out for review as soon as we possibly could, so that we could start talking through the issues, talking through our methodology, working with all of you and the community to make sure we're accurately identifying resources in South Glendale. I wanted to thank the Glendale Historical Society for the review that they have done to date. I appreciate being a volunteer, as I have done similar exercises for other organizations, and I know it's a lot of time and work. So we definitely appreciate their participation and welcome their feedback. I also wanted to acknowledge our internal team. John Locascio, who I think all of you may know, is an architect in our office, and he was instrumental in helping me look at particularly collections of property types for which there are many in South Glendale, and figuring out how to vet those and how to identify the ones that really rise to the level of individually eligible resources. Because he's an architect, he's an excellent resource for me in terms of identifying materials and changes over time. So John has definitely been a big part of this effort. We also had Sion Winship on the team, who Sion largely wrote the context statement that we did a few years ago, and she provided research assistance for this project as well, which was really excellent and very helpful in helping us sort of uncover some of the histories of some of these buildings. And Robbie Orangarin, who was my partner in the field and also our GIS specialist, so all the mapping is courtesy of Robbie. We also have a number of senior staff members who do surveys quite a lot, including people who worked a lot on Survey LA. So I just want to reiterate that this is a group effort at HRG. We take these things very seriously, and we really try to evaluate them, vet them, discuss them internally to make sure that as a firm we're all on board with what we're presenting to the public. So I'm not sure how long this is going to be, and we have a lot to cover, so you guys can cut me off if we're getting a little too detailed or if this is going... Yes, you can't hear me when I don't. Yes, I'm sorry about that. Sure. So I'll just get started and walk through the methodology and some of our findings. But like I said, if you have questions or if you feel that this is going on too long, just please feel free to let me know. So I wanted to just start off and briefly talk about what a historic resources survey is and what it's not. It's really meant to be a planning tool. As you all know, nothing gets designated as part of the survey process. This is just a planning process to identify potential historic resources. Designation is a whole separate process. It's meant to be systematic so that we identify potential resources, we do additional research, and then we document those properties that reflect important themes in the city's growth and development. And in this case, those are the themes that were identified in the historic context statement. All of the properties are evaluated to determine if they meet identified criteria. So I think that's an important point that I wanted to make for this survey in particular. It's not meant to be an inventory of properties that still remain from a certain period of development, but it's really meant to identify those that we would feel comfortable saying this should be on the Glendale Register. This is an individually eligible property that should be designated as part of Glendale's history. And I'll talk a little bit later about the 6L properties, which is one planning tool that you can use to protect neighborhood character for properties that may not be individually eligible, but which warrant some type of consideration and contribute to neighborhood character or have some particular association with history. And hopefully through the community plan process, there will be other planning tools like that that might help to address some of the issues with zoning and changes over time in South Glendale. I also wanted to just mention that surveys are meant to be a snapshot in time. There are certainly limitations to what we're doing. We're looking at everything from the public right-of-way, so there may be some things going on some buildings that we're not able to see as a surveyor. We do as much research as we possibly can to figure out changes over time or the history of a building. And we have to document the building as it stands today. So Jay and I have actually had numerous conversations about alterations that are reversible and how we treat those. But according to guidance from the National Park Service, we really need to look at what does it look like today. We can't presume that a building might be rehabilitated in the future. So just know that the findings are as the building is today. We certainly recommend, and cities are required to regularly update their surveys. So if someone were to do a rehab on a building and it would become eligible, that should be reconsidered in the future. We conducted this survey according to standard practice in the preservation profession. There are several bulletins produced by the National Register for how to evaluate properties and how to do historic resources surveys. There's additional guidance out there from the California Office of Historic Preservation. The survey was done looking at properties that are eligible for the National Register, the California Register, and locally in Glendale, either individually or as part of a historic district. As I mentioned, the themes are from the historic context statement. The context statement also includes general eligibility standards for evaluating properties from various periods of time. The eligibility considerations consider how rare is a property, what types of things should you think about in identifying and evaluating properties that are potentially eligible under each of the themes. Those eligibility standards in a document like that are usually general guidance, and then when you go out and actually do the field survey, they often get refined once you sort of know the overall population of the buildings. We have been consulting with city staff all along the process, so we've had numerous meetings and phone calls to go through preliminary findings even before we got to this set of properties that you're looking at today, to talk about how to handle certain property types. We've had lots of discussion back and forth about the thresholds for eligibility, so just know we've been working very closely with city staff. A big part of what we've done is comparative analysis, like I said. So bungalows, for example, from the early 20th century, even though there are no longer neighborhoods of those properties in South Glendale, there are numerous individual examples scattered throughout the survey area. So we looked at those very carefully and talked about how to evaluate them. There's also a very large collection of multifamily residential properties. So again, we looked at those as a collection of buildings and identified the ones that really rise to the level of an individually significant building. We also considered, even though this is a survey of South Glendale, and there are certain themes and properties that are specific because they're in South Glendale, for other property types or architectural styles that are prevalent throughout the city, we also had to consider how does this stack up against other examples of these that might be found elsewhere. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but Spanish Colonial Revival Architecture, for example, there are wonderful, excellent examples scattered throughout the city. So we had to think about how do these stack up in comparison to some of those. And again, this is an ongoing process. We're still internally vetting things. We're still going through our findings to make sure things weren't missed. Once we established some of these thresholds, we needed to go back and make sure we are now capturing all the things that we said would be eligible under those thresholds. So that's all still being worked on in our office as well as with the community. I wanted to just briefly mention the California Historical Resources Status Codes because that will probably come up a lot tonight. These were developed by the California State Office of Historic Preservation. They were updated in the early 2000s, and they're really meant to be a means for classifying historic resources so that you can check an inventory list and quickly see if your building is eligible or not. There's two pieces of information conveyed by the status code. The first is the designation level, so is it eligible for the National Register or just locally? And then the second piece of information is the type of evaluation. Was it identified through survey, which you would know, again, has certain limitations, or was it the result of a more in-depth analysis or an official determination of eligibility as part of a project review? The most common status codes that you're going to see in the survey findings for this project are 3S or 3CS, which are individual properties that are identified as eligible for the National or California registers. 5S3 is eligible for local designation. 6L are those properties that did not rise to the level of being eligible for designation, but still had some characteristics that we felt should be considered in planning. And I just want to mention a lot of cities use the 6L status code in their survey work, but they don't actually have a way to regulate those properties in the planning department, and Glendale actually does. And I think because of that, this status code is really meaningful here in ways that it isn't in a lot of other cities. So that's actually a great development, and I think Jay, I'm not sure if tonight or at some other point, may talk about some further refinements that could be made to the treatment of the 6L properties. And then we do have a small number of historic districts, so properties that are eligible as contributors have a separate status code indicating that. As you know, there have been several surveys in the past of the South Glendale area specifically. We looked at all of those and considered the data from previous surveys in our efforts. So just a little note about the status of the project. As Jay mentioned, you have received preliminary survey findings. The list that you received as part of this meeting includes the 5S3 and 6L properties. So again, either eligible or warrant consideration in planning. Typically, we only document eligible properties as part of a survey, and in fact, that was our work plan for this. But because of the methodology and some of the questions surrounding properties identified in South Glendale, we're also going to give you a list before your next meeting of those properties that we looked at and researched and evaluated and determined they weren't eligible, so that you'll have a little bit more of an idea about why some things were identified as eligible and why some things were not. I'll talk a little more about the methodology here tonight, but you'll be getting a list prior to the next meeting. You also have the survey report that accompanies the preliminary survey findings, and I just wanted to address that because that was one of the questions in one of the letters that you received. We typically do the survey report at the close of the project to discuss what the scope of the project was, what we were asked to look at by the city, discuss the methodology, and then summarize the findings. And it's meant to be sort of an encapsulation of the project so that moving forward, people will understand, you know, what did they look at, why were certain things identified as eligible. So we decided to do a draft of that at this stage, just again to kind of let you know what we're thinking as we're identifying and evaluating these properties. So that report will also continue to be updated, and we'll have a final report that gets delivered along with the final survey findings. So to come will be the final recommendations, which, as Jay mentioned, will come after this longer process and will include any public input that comes during the EIR process for the community plan. We will be giving you the recommendations of what properties we think are eligible. We will document the properties that were evaluated and found not eligible, and we'll figure out the level of documentation for those for the final deliverable. I also wanted to mention that we will be also presenting the city with a database with all of this information so that it can be linked to your GIS system here, and DPR forms for the eligible properties and the 6L properties. And I bring that up now just to say that, you know, what you're looking at now is a list, and it has as much information as we could reasonably fit on the paper, but we have a lot more documentation that will be provided to the city with the final product, and it has been reviewed with the city through this stage. So this is a map of the South Glendale Community Plan area. So this is our survey area, the project area. The green boundary shows what was Glendale in the late 19th century, and the blue boundary in the bottom left shows what was Tropico. And so that is important for the evaluation of early properties. We did look at things that were associated with Tropico before it was consolidated with Glendale. We know quite a lot about the character of South Glendale through our work on the historic context statement. So as you all know, this is the oldest portion of the city. The boundaries that I just showed you were the original portions of the city. They include the oldest commercial and industrial corridors. As I mentioned, we're talking about Glendale and Tropico, and then other areas that were annexed to the city by 1918. Some of the earliest residential neighborhoods are here, which have a particular character and a particular challenge when you're doing a survey. There have been several significant periods of growth. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there was a lot of growth and development here, particularly after Glendale incorporated as a city. There was a lot of residential development immediately following that. And in the 1920s, which is consistent with development in Southern California overall, there was another growth spurt in the 20s. And then there are a couple of periods after the war where there was significant development in Glendale. But by that point, a lot of it was redevelopment or infill construction in already established neighborhoods. And also just a brief point that you all are aware of, that, you know, zoning changes and planning decisions over time in the city have had an impact on these neighborhoods in South Glendale. So we are aware that there are particular challenges here, and we're trying to look and really identify those things that remain from those earlier periods that are eligible for designation, with a sensitivity to the fact that these are early neighborhoods that have seen a lot of change over time. Just some statistics, and there's lots of numbers in the report that were just sort of provided as general benchmarks. Again, all of those numbers have already changed as we've continued to do research and evaluations. But just to give you kind of an idea of how many parcels in the area are from certain periods of development, you can see that through the end of the 1920s, it's approximately 3,500 parcels that still have buildings on them from those periods. And then you can see in the 30s and the 40s, that slows down a little bit, and then we see some post-war growth with about 3,600 properties built through the 1970s. So when you're looking at the numbers of resources that are actually identified, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind where those spurts were. And I can't remember the exact number, but there's a very small number of properties from the 19th century. So those were, of course, given particular importance in our findings. So just quickly, a little bit more about methodology. We did look at all the previous evaluations. The very first thing we did after accumulating all the previous survey data and also going back through the context statement and identifying any properties that were called out in that document is we did a windshield survey of the entire survey area. So we drove every street, we looked at the properties that had already been identified, and then we flagged other properties that we thought might be eligible. After that, we went back and did property-specific and neighborhood-specific research on those areas that we thought might have potential historic significance. We discussed methodology for identifying thresholds with city staff after that windshield process, and then again after we had done some preliminary findings. So, like I said, this is continuing to evolve. There we go. And some of the sources that we used for research include Sanborn maps, and those proved to be particularly helpful in the survey area in identifying some changes to properties over time. We also found a number of properties that had been relocated that we discovered through looking at the Sanborn maps. It also helped us untangle some questions because street names have changed over time. Sometimes the address has changed. So the Sanborn maps are very valuable for sort of uncovering all of that information. Sion did building permit research for all the properties that were identified. There's some challenges with building permit research in all cities, so there's some limitations there, but we did pull any permits that we could for all of these properties. We looked at historic photos where they're available and a lot at aerial photographs, which function a lot like the Sanborns do in just helping identify, is the building footprint still the same? How did the neighborhood change over time? We did city directory research for the residential properties to try to identify if there were any important people who lived in any of the properties. And of course, we did primary and secondary source research like newspapers, periodicals. I should actually particularly mention Sean Bursell, who's done a ton of research in periodicals from the early 20th century that's been very valuable. And those are not easy to find all the time. So this map just shows the preliminary findings. This corresponds to the list that you have. It doesn't, of course, take into account any changes we've made in the last month or the most recent submission by the Glendale Historical Society. I know it's hard to see even at 11 by 17, but we wanted to just sort of show you there are resources scattered throughout the entire area. There are some areas that are more dense with resources than other areas, so those might be something in particular to consider during the community plan process. We tried to break it down a little bit by property type just to give you an idea. And this map was provided to the city as a PDF as well, so hopefully it will be provided in digital form, and then you can zoom in and see a little better what we are trying to convey with this. So I just wanted to walk you through some of the property types and talk a little bit more about our methodology for evaluating resources from each period. As I said, a lot of these property types had a great deal of comparative analysis to come to the list that we have in front of you today. I will say that a lot of this is difficult, which is why we have a whole team, and John and I argue with each other a lot about which ones rise to the level. There's a certain amount of properties that are on the border, and we're happy to discuss those further, revisit those, discuss the methodology more. So, like I said at the beginning, just know that we really sweat this stuff and really try to do the best evaluations that we can. This slide shows some 19th century examples. As I mentioned, there aren't very many properties left from this period, so eligible examples include properties that may have had some alteration. Most of these are eligible because of their early construction date. The one in the lower left is also associated with Elias Byram, who was an early pioneer. We think this was his actual house, so it's eligible for that association with him as an important person in Glendale history. And then when we move into the early 20th century, you can see, obviously, we're starting to see more significant architectural examples, or at least a little bit more architectural refinement than some of the farmhouses from the 19th century. We looked at properties from the early 20th century very carefully, and we considered, based on what we had determined in doing the context statement, that 1918 was really the cutoff for early development in South Glendale. The boundaries as they exist today were in place by 1918. Most of the neighborhoods were starting to be, or a lot of the neighborhoods were starting to be developed, especially in the flat areas. Hillside development came a little bit later for obvious technological reasons, but so buildings that were built before 1918 also got special consideration in our findings. They may have a few more alterations than what we would allow for a building built in the early 1920s, just because they are these remnants of those early residential neighborhoods. For the most part, as you all know, these are middle class or working class neighborhoods, so it really is about the collection of resources, and because we didn't find historic districts in Glendale, we were trying to identify those properties that really reflect that remnant. So again, it isn't every property that remains from before 1918, but those ones that are still intact enough to represent early residential development in South Glendale. Oops. Every time I have 2 pages of notes, I go 2 slides forward. There are some really excellent examples of Craftsman architecture in South Glendale. A couple of these are transitional examples from sort of the turn of the 20th century, and then you'll see some really representative examples of what we all know as the Craftsman style. There are some examples that have arroyo stone or clinker brick details and really reflect the Craftsman movement. Those are differentiated from the more modest examples that we'll see, especially as we move into the 1920s. And then just a note about the 6L properties from this early period. As I mentioned, we really looked closely at the pre-1918 properties. We are doing a double check to make sure we've captured everything from 1918 because the methodology evolved as we were working on this project. So we have a number of 6L properties, and those are buildings that have been altered and that we just felt that we couldn't make a justification for individual designation in the Glendale Register, but they're early, they still generally represent that historic period, and so we picked them up under that 6L category. Some of these are more heavily altered than others. The one in the bottom right is pretty substantially altered, but it dates to 1898, so we felt that it still should be, consideration should be given to that if alterations are proposed in the future. And then here are some examples that we identified as not eligible. And again, you'll be getting a list of these properties with a brief justification for the determination before the next meeting. But, you know, some are more obvious than others. Some are very heavily altered. Some, like the example in the lower left, is a fairly modest bungalow, and it has had its windows replaced and the window openings altered on the primary facade. So based on our methodology for this project that was discussed with city staff and internally, we felt that the primary facade needed to be intact for these properties in order for them to actually be eligible. And then when we get into the post-1918 period, we're really looking at 2 things. They had to be highly intact, so a much higher threshold for integrity, and they had to have some distinctive design. So again, the more modest bungalows that don't really have any architectural features would not have been identified from this early period in the 1920s. They had to be really an excellent example of what they are and highly intact. And I didn't make a slide of these, but it was interesting as we were going through the early 1920s. There are a lot of really nice American Colonial Revival examples in South Glendale. A lot of them are the same plan, just with slightly different details on the porch. And so there's a number of those that were picked up as eligible for representing that sort of transition from the Craftsman era into the 1920s period revival. And then here are just some examples from the post-1918 era that are, the top 2 are 6Ls because they are still largely intact, but either had a minor alteration or were not an excellent example of their style, or 6Zs on the bottom, which are ones that have had alterations to the primary facade. Spanish Colonial Revival residential development or residential architecture in South Glendale was, again, another tricky category for us. We know that there are some really excellent examples of the style that are eligible for their architecture. There's 2 examples on this slide, one of which is by Paul Williams, who is a significant architect in Southern California and Los Angeles and beyond. There are a lot of Spanish Colonial Revival residences in neighborhoods scattered throughout South Glendale. We have at least one district of Spanish Colonial Revival architecture. Because most of them are not excellent architecturally, they don't rise to that level, they were not identified as eligible as part of this survey. So those are eligible as collections of resources from 1920s residences, but again, in thinking about the architecture in Glendale overall and not just South Glendale specifically, that was a threshold that was established early in the project. Tudor revival is very rare in South Glendale, but there are, again, excellent examples throughout the city as a whole. So we identified those examples that were prominent and the best reflections of Tudor revival architecture as eligible locally. The two on the bottom of this slide were identified as 6Ls because they are standard builder plans. They don't have any particular architectural significance, but because Tudor revival is rare in the survey area, they were again captured under that 6L category. So if alterations are proposed in the future, their character-defining features would have to be considered. And there's a very small collection of storybook residences, which I put in here because I like them, and they're very rare. And so we did pick up a small handful of those. So that's sort of a subset of Tudor revival that got a special attention. And there's also a nice collection of mid-century modern houses, particularly in the hillside. So this is an area that I would say is difficult from the survey perspective, especially the ones that are in the hills because they're hard to see. So we certainly welcome input if we have missed anything that you or anyone in the community knows of mid-century modernism in Glendale. There's some really nice examples that are already listed in the Glendale Register, and we tried to capture the rest of the ones that we could identify from the street. And now we get to multifamily residential development. This is another category for which there are many resources in the South Glendale Community Plan area. This is another one where we relied heavily on guidance from the Park Service about how to identify things that really rise to the level of individual significance. There's guidance specifically that says, just because something was built during a certain period and is an example of a type, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's eligible. So this was another one where we did a lot of comparative analysis. We looked at all the examples of several multifamily property types to come to the list that you have in front of you. And again, I understand some of these are parsing the line very carefully, so we're happy to discuss those further. There's a large collection of duplexes from the early 20th century through the 1920s, so you'll see there's actually a large number of those that were identified as part of the survey. Most of them are Spanish Colonial Revival, but there are some earlier examples. There are a lot of apartment buildings from the 1920s, some really excellent and unique examples. The one in the bottom right actually has Batchelder tile in the lunettes above the windows in the entrance, which was an exciting discovery. Maybe you knew that already, but we thought we discovered it. And we have actually been in communication with the Pasadena Museum of History, who's compiling a database of all known examples of Batchelder tile, so they've added this building to their resource list. 1920s apartment houses, and I would say it's really 1920s and 1930s. This was a category that is heavily represented in South Glendale. The examples that were identified as eligible are really those that are excellent architectural examples, and they don't have any alterations, particularly on the primary facade. There are some examples that are less notable architecturally, or they may have some minor alterations that were identified in that 6L category. There are lots of wonderful courtyard apartments. These, I think, are a real treasure in South Glendale, and there are lots of really nice examples. Some are in historic districts, but most of them are standalone individual resources. And there's post-World War II multifamily residential development throughout the area, and this is a property type that we looked at carefully, and we are reevaluating based on feedback that we've already gotten from the community. So we'll be refining the findings for post-war multifamily as we move forward. Commercial development, I think, was more straightforward. I may be wrong about that, and I'm happy to talk about that further at a future meeting. But we have resources in South Glendale from every period of development. We have some remnant early examples. We have some really nice post-war examples that are also significant architecturally. We have some unique property types, such as the walk-up food stand in the bottom right. So again, we tried to be generous with the early examples and more rigorous with the later ones, and really identify those that are truly eligible for designation. Here are some that were identified as 6L property type, or 6L properties, and again, these have some alteration or some other consideration that meant they're not eligible for designation, but that we'd like the city to consider moving forward. Another really strong property type in South Glendale is the Ecclesiastical Architecture. There's really beautiful, these are not professional words, beautiful, fantastic examples of ecclesiastical architecture throughout the survey area. So I just bring this up because there's really a great collection, and we identified a number of these as eligible for the National Register, not just at the local level. Institutional and cultural development, this considers schools, civic buildings, parkland. Of course, there's some wonderful municipal buildings in Glendale. Some have been designated, some have not, that have been identified as part of the survey. And then we have industrial development, and this was another tricky area. Because this is an early industrial portion of the city, we were really looking at these buildings carefully. We tried to give accommodation to the buildings from the 1920s, of which there really aren't very many left. And the post-war examples, we had to think carefully. In order to be eligible from a later period, it had to be associated with an important industry, of which there were many in Glendale. So if we found a building associated with the aerospace industry, for example, we flagged that in the survey. Or buildings that are a particular industrial property type. Some of these factory buildings are really good representations of their type. And then we have a number of 6L industrial properties. Some of these are in small collections, so there may be a street of industrial development from a certain period that individually they don't rise to the level of being eligible for designation, but as a collection we thought at a minimum the city should consider if any changes are proposed in those areas. And then we have a number of historic districts, which I can walk you through very quickly because I know this has been lengthy. The districts, we were really trying to pay attention and identify any area that we could capture as a historic district because we think that's valuable for planning purposes. Again, it sort of gets those collections of buildings that represent really the development patterns in South Glendale. So we have a number of historic districts that were identified. Several of them are multifamily districts. One is a recommended extension to a district that's already been designated. And then we also are recommending a number of planning districts. And this is the district version of the 6L individual property where collectively an area might still retain a sense of time and place, but when you start looking at the individual buildings, they have all had a certain degree of alteration so that they don't rise to the level of being eligible as a historic district, but they still have neighborhood characteristics that we think are important to protect moving forward. This is not something that is currently accommodated in the city's zoning code or in preservation practice here, but it's a recommendation we're making as part of this study that the city maybe consider developing some guidelines or other standards for looking at these areas. And, these are the ones we identified from a historic preservation perspective. This may be a mechanism that can be used in South Glendale for other areas as well. Jay might not like me saying that. So we identified several neighborhoods that we thought would be planning districts. One is the Diamond Residential Planning District, which is an early neighborhood in the southwest portion of the survey area. Glendale Heights, which is in the hills and has a broader period of development. These houses, I think, are from the 20s through the immediate post-war period. We have an area that was largely developed in the 1920s and 1930s. Two of them, actually. And then the Missionary Colony Planning District is really just capturing those remnants of the missionary colony that had already been altered by a previous project. But because it has a unique history and a story that isn't anywhere else in Glendale, we thought the remnant properties that are still there should at least be considered for future planning projects. So that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions or however you want to proceed.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for all the work into your entire team. I also appreciate you acknowledging the work of the Glendale Historic Society and welcoming their comments and feedback. I think it'll make for a better result all around. But I'll just open it up to questions. I'm sure we have quite a few for you. Does anyone want to go first?
Oh,
Well,
I'm sorry about that.
In
I
the
thought
picture
that-
section.
Oh, in the picture section,
Yeah.
okay.
It's alphabetical.
They're numbered.
Still, you thumb through it.
Yeah.
Can we start?
When did you start this endeavor?
We started, I think, at the end of the year last year, and
Wow.
then it got postponed a little bit because we were originally going in concert with, with the EIR schedule. So we were delayed a little bit, but we started doing research at the end of last year.
Well, job well done. This is a breadth of information that's been very entertaining, actually. It's seeing all of these great, character homes in context, out of context, but all together is quite a treat. So, thank you.
I had a quick question, or just a couple of. So on page 19 of your report, it says that there are 13,296 legal parcels in South Glendale, and 8,500 were constructed prior to 1979.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering why the significance of that date.
Nothing really, just sort of in general, the late 1970s or 1980 has been a cutoff for other surveys we've been working on. I understand, I think you have a 40-year window here. Is that right?
No, 30 years.
I'm sorry, 30 years. So we're a little bit shy of that, but we were just trying to make a distinction between the total number of parcels and the ones that might be considered historic.
Just by way of background, when we put together, work on the proposal, it was my hope that we would take this through the year 2000 and be very progressive. As Christine and her team were looking at that, there weren't many resources between 1979 and 2000 that looked like, at least in today's mindset, that we could evaluate in a meaningful way. And they kind of walked me back from that. And we agreed that this timeline was the correct one.
Okay, great. And then quickly, you had a slide at the beginning that sort of broke out the number of resources in different date ranges.
Mm-hmm.
Does that add up to the 8,500, or was that also just what? Does
Yes.
that
Well, the exception is that I didn't include the 19th century residences on that slide, and I can't remember the number, but yes.
It's roughly.
Those
that's
should
what
all,
it's roughly
yes, it should
relating
roughly
to.
relate to the 8,500.
Okay. And then.
And that slide is not in our materials.
Yeah, I couldn't find
But
it.
It's
data.
not. That was something I thought might be helpful for this presentation, and we can certainly include more data in the next round of the report.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And thank you, too. I mean, this is just a huge effort. And you mentioned that you guys started at the end of last year. May I ask how many people were on your field team?
So we had, Robbie and I did most of the driving around, but we also consulted with John and with Sion. So we had 4 people doing field work.
And if I understand, it was all mostly your methodology was looking at prior surveys and actual designations that have already been made, but mostly, I mean, it wasn't anything on the ground like Survey LA, right? Because I think that was like on the ground looking at every single.
We did do
parcel.
that. So we started by accumulating the previous survey data so that we knew which properties had already been evaluated, but then we also drove each street or walked each street, depending on the circumstance, to look at things, to flag additional properties that might be eligible. And then we studied that whole collection of resources.
Right.
And I think we have added value in this survey. This is a kind of a hybrid survey in terms of a windshield survey, but a windshield survey generally isn't going to do a significant amount of background research on any of the properties. So this isn't quite a comprehensive, intensive level survey, but it is more than a typical reconnaissance or windshield survey. So we're part of the reason we're very happy, and we've received great comments from TGHS filling in some gaps in that history, is because we're able now to give people, what we've been doing currently is if we see something as a 6L, we're saying, well, we don't know who lived there, we don't know what happened there. People are having to prepare historic assessments for individual properties. This survey is going to take us beyond that because we're able to do that in that depth of research to tell us those things.
So now I have a quick question for you, Jay, because it's Christine, right?
Yes.
Sorry. You mentioned that 6L properties are regulated in Glendale, whereas they're generally not in other cities. So how are we regulating our
Yeah, for our current
6L?
policy is focused more on the Craftsman properties because they seem to be the most fragile that we have citywide, but especially in South Glendale. When we have properties, we have the Craftsman Survey, which we haven't talked about much, but in 2007 we did a Craftsman Survey, as I think all of you are aware. That was done only in our higher density zones, so it didn't do as much, there wasn't as much survey done as we're having in the current survey. When properties were identified as 6Ls in the Craftsman Survey, if someone, which is quite common, comes to us and says, I would like to stucco my wood-sided Craftsman house, we say, no, you can't do that. We have, as a matter of current policy, allowed people sometimes to remove the wood siding and put on hardy board siding or any kind of cementitious siding that's on the market today. What we are going to do, and we'll be taking input from the Commission and the public on this, is we're going to extend the protections for 6L properties to the range of 6Ls that we see here. What I'm picturing is one thing we don't do is regulate window changes in terms of the Muntin grid patterns. We have a special provision in our window replacement guidelines which affect all of these properties, that if we have what we call special windows, which would be Craftsman houses that have the more elaborate or the more unusual Muntin patterns, we don't allow those to be replaced, or we would take it to a hearing for someone to propose replacing those. What we're thinking about right now, and this is still in flux, would be to maintain window grid patterns, even if they're the more classic 6/6, 6/1, more traditional patterns that today we would allow to be replaced with single pane glass on a double hung window. We would maintain our policy of not allowing craftsmen to be stuccoed. Our general design review protects a lot of things. When people come to us and say, I want to take the clay tile off my Spanish Colonial Revival and put asphalt shingles, we're already saying no to that. So that wouldn't be, we'll continue that pattern. But what I envision is a more comprehensive kind of set of guidelines for staff to look at when we're talking about proposed alterations to 6Ls. So we're doing it, what I picture is an expanded program, and we haven't finalized that yet, obviously.
Can you speak to, though, how a plan checker at the counter knows it is a 6L property when an owner comes before them?
All of the results here are going to be put on the Glendale property portal, so planners at the counter will be able to open that up very easily, actually. And we're also going to have holds on all of the properties. So
from 6L up?
From 6L, yeah.
From 6L up?
Mm-hmm. And we're planning to put holds on the properties. I know this is an issue of some discussion with the Historical Society. We have been directed that we will be putting holds on all of the properties being identified as 5 or 6L in the survey. We were waiting until we kind of begin this process. Tonight's the formal debut of this survey. So we're going to work with our IS department to kind of put some putting holds on has been a very time-consuming process because we've done them individually over the years. There are ways we can do it globally, so we're going to work with the database that HRG is producing and try to get the holds on as soon as possible.
So in the current database at the counter, there's a field for these classifications, or that has to be customized, entered before the holds could take place?
I'm not sure. The hold comes up at when the property is pulled up at the counter. And in theory, all of the planners should be looking at that. I think there have been slips over time. I don't know how we're going to address that.
But I guess my question is, are they having to open up a separate survey or a separate database?
No, they're
or
using the same. They're using.
The database has a field that instantly, when they look up address and it talks about property type, building type, all that, it will say status.
All of our most of our city agencies use a database called CSI, City Services Interface. something like that. CSI is the term we need. CSI is the basic. To issue a permit, you do that through CSI. You cannot issue a permit if there's a hard hold on it. The hard hold has to be released to issue a permit. So even if someone makes a mistake and lets something pass by, when the person is going to pay for their permit, and just one of the techs at the counter who have no interest in preservation, no knowledge, they're going to be ready to process it. They won't be able to. It's going to come back to us ultimately. So the system is as unfoolproof as we've been able to make it so far.
But that current functionality exists, or there's that current functionality of having the status code in there and having a hold is active.
The
today,
status code is not in CSI, but CSI has the capability of pulling up the DPR forms. So there will be a hold. The planner at the counter will find a hold. They'll look. They'll see there's an attachment. They can open up the attachment. They can print it out and hand it to the person at the counter. We're going to have to do some training so staff knows what a 6L versus a 5S3 is. I think most of my colleagues know that at this point, but we'll kind of make sure. And that would have to be done on an ongoing basis, obviously. But yeah, so the information's there. CSI is a Byzantine architecture, but most of the stuff that we need is right up front, including the hold is very clear, the attachments are very clear, and then for the public, the property portal is going to be the easiest way to find things, and we're going to have every DPR form. And I can't promise that we're going to put that up on the portal right now, because I think we'll have to wait for this to be finalized. But in the interim, because it's going to take, as we've said, another 6 months maybe, we'll get the holds put on.
So I think maybe to your question, Jay, did you say that only the 6Ls from the Craftsman survey of 2007 are currently on hold in the system?
Well, no, we have lots of things on hold. We have all of our Glendale Register properties, all of our historic district properties. We have properties that have been identified by the community that we're interested in. We have a lot of flexibility with how we apply the holds. We try not to do it indiscriminately, though, but so we're...
Okay.
So those will include the ones that HRG is doing as 6L, or it will?
Yes. The number of holds is going to increase dramatically through this process.
And that will happen when the final survey result?
No. The holds we want to get on faster, because there have been, HRG's identified a couple of instances where properties that are on the survey have had permits issued for work that is going to affect their ultimate status code. And we want to avoid that, but we also wanted to kind of vet it internally, make sure everyone was comfortable doing that, and then make this part of this public debut of the survey, rather holding people to a level of review that hadn't been formally kind of discussed at the city level.
So would it be fair to say by October 31st those holds will be in place, or what's it?
I can't speak
what's
for
date?
our IS.
What's the
poll,
what date are we looking at? I mean, generally.
It's going to be as soon as possible. We'll talk to IS about it. They've had some internal issues with staffing and CSI. We'll do our best. Eric is here tonight. He will hold me to that. So
Go, Eric.
Maybe we could just keep it on our monthly agenda
Yes,
until for updates.
updates on whether it's happened or
Yeah.
not? Sure.
Yeah, agendize it.
Yeah, hopefully by October 21st, we'll say it's happened.
Beautiful.
Hopefully.
Okay, sorry, Lauren, when you continue.
Nope, I think that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Actually, may I ask a question of our speaker?
Sure.
The list that you received from the Glendale Historical Society, how did that, what was HRG's sort of initial reaction to it? Were there surprises on that list? Were there some of them you had already debated? How did that go?
I think it was the most detailed list we've ever received doing a survey. So I
Congratulations by
give
that.
them
Thank you.
credit for that. It was an immense amount of work. A lot of them we had discussed already, but we went back and relooked at everything that was on their list again just to make sure. As I mentioned at the outset, our first thing we did after we accumulated the previous survey data was drive the streets ourselves and flag all the things that looked like it might be significant. So we may have discarded some things at that phase of the survey that then didn't get additional research on our part. those properties in particular, if they were on the Glendale Historical Society list, we made sure to go back, relook at them in the field, and look at the research they provided and do any additional research we needed to. A lot of information is on the 6Z list or the not eligible list that hadn't been provided to anyone yet, so we anticipate answering a lot of questions once that list is received. I'm sure it won't satisfy everything because a lot of it is, subjective or based on our thresholds that we identified for this survey, but we do have research or backup for those decisions. And there were certainly things in some of the hillside neighborhoods that we couldn't see or didn't see that they pointed out to us that we're very grateful. When you're doing a field survey, there's a number of external factors that sometimes mean you miss things, so we're grateful for that. We try to be careful, like I said, and not have that happen and make sure that we're looking at, maps with date ranges and that kind of thing. But there's always a few properties that we don't know about. So I would say on the whole, we're very grateful to have community input. We want to have the survey be accurate and as helpful to the city as it can be. So we're happy to relook at all those properties.
Good.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question on the 5SC. So after you have identified all of them, it still takes the owner to go forward with the property itself. Is the city going to inform the owner that, you could be eligible for the Glendale Register if you do these things? Or is it it's just in our database and the owners of those homes won't know about it?
Yes, cities traditionally that do these large-scale surveys do not notify individual property owners about the survey results. That's an open question right now. I expect City Council will be wondering the same question, and we don't have an answer. The means to do that is there. That is also the means to open up Pandora's box, which is another thing that we have to think about. Christine may be able to attest to that.
Yes.
So we'll have to have it's something that's on our minds. It's something we're thinking about. I assume City Council members will ask the same question. By the time it gets to them, we may have a better answer than I have right now. But we have never in the past, with the Craftsman survey or any of our other surveys, except for our historic district surveys, obviously, notified people. Los Angeles certainly didn't, and I doubt would be able to do that for Survey LA. And I'm not familiar with other cities that do that on any kind of routine basis, unless anyone here corrects me.
And then, sorry, do you have more?
I just have a question.
Okay.
The methodology statement, is there a specific statement, or is it just these 2 pages that are 16 and 17 as far as the process? Is there a statement per se?
There is a discussion under each general property type or theme that talks about the thresholds or some of the reasoning behind the decision making. So I don't have the report in front of me. I apologize. So I'm not sure what page it's on, but there's general methodology about how we did the survey.
Right.
And then there's a section that talks about, we looked at, early residential development from pre-1918 in this way. We looked at 1918 to 25 in this way. We looked at multifamily in this way. So that's in that document.
Okay, I didn't
somewhere.
find just a statement. But the other question...
If you look at page 20 onward, there's a methodology discussion for each of the kind of broader content.
Right, I was looking just for a statement, per se, 2 or 3 paragraphs. The other thing, in 1918, that date is because of the borders of the city of Glendale itself, right?
In general, yes, that, the city, the borders looked at then as they do now, but also we had identified that doing the context work just based on reading the history of South Glendale, that seemed to make sense as a cutoff date. And then when we went out in the field, I would say that was underscored for us, that really we saw development patterns changing when you move into the 20s. The architecture is different. The houses are simpler. They're starting to be interspersed with other kinds of development. So it still made sense to us, but we wanted to make sure that any nice examples from that early 20s period are still captured in some way. So there were examples added to the findings from that period as well.
Okay.
Are individual property owners notified of the fact that the survey is going on in South Glendale?
No.
Okay.
Just strangers driving around.
Yeah.
Everyone done? Can I ask a question? Or?
Well, just,
Well-
the historic districts, same thing. It all has to come from the people that live in those. Riverdale has been historic since 1910, and it's been identified as such, but there's nobody that lives in any of those Riverdale homes. And if you're out there, there's a good chance that it would be a historic district.
Yes, but we're still able to protect it even if
even
they
if
don't
not.
move forward with the district. So.
Oh, the other thing I want to say, city directories, though they're being digitized right at the moment, they're all at the Los Angeles Public Library, bottom floor. I was just there 2 days ago looking at them. So
Yes,
they're
I
all
can
there.
tell you, Sion spent a lot of time down there.
The elevator is the only way down.
Yes, she can attest to that.
Can you bring your bicycle down?
I found a picture of me with my bicycle, and I forgot to bring it today.
We're gonna
I will bring
treasure
it.
that.
I'll email
Like
it to you.
bring-
I'll put it on the front page
We're gonna
of our
post it
meeting.
here.
So.
Yeah,
Anything else?
I don't, well, they're just little notes. That's just all.
I think that's it for now.
Yeah, and Commissioner Morgan, are those specific notes about aspects? Like,
Well, they're just little notes on, like Riverdale and some of the historic districts. I do favor what they've said about the proposed, not the historic districts, but the planning districts. I know the city doesn't, and I know, but I find that fascinating idea. There are, when we ran up in North Glendale, when we ran on Manhattan Avenue, we ran into, there was a property now since gone that was the oldest home in that part of town, and we had the city come out and look at them, but they said that the context, the buildings have been altered, but it definitely was, the Bonettos owned the property, they built the homes, but there wasn't enough for a historic district, but I'm sure there would have been enough material for a residential planning district on it, and I find that fascinating, and I'm all for it if you could do it. There's so many areas.
if the commission can remember that for future discussion at the upcoming meetings, we wanted that to be part of this proposal as a recommendation because it is a way that we can help protect. Now, some would argue that because of our intense design review policy in Glendale, the whole city is sort of what is traditionally called a conservation district. But that doesn't prevent some of these two-story larger buildings that people are concerned about scale issues and things from happening. A planning district, which is also called more traditionally a conservation district in preservation, would be able to help with that. If that's a recommendation from the commission, we would kind of move that forward as this goes ultimately to city council. Ultimately, that would require kind of a new ordinance, I think, to create this, and we'd have to develop a mechanism for land use regulation that way. The other broad-based way to affect some of the issues that we're seeing right now would be through zoning changes, which have nothing to do with historic preservation, but if there were areas identified as particularly fragile and a zoning change could be made that would reduce development pressure in those areas. Over the years, the city has downzoned a couple of times since the 80s. We'd have to do that with a full comprehensive review of the entire zoning. We can't just kind of pick and choose where we're doing it. That's probably beyond the commission's purview, except as a recommendation to consider it if, as you review the document, you start seeing areas where, wow, there's this great concentration here, and the current zoning is really an incentive to lose what's there. So I'd say for members of the community as well as the commission, that's one of the other tools that we have, where because a historic survey isn't a broad brush tool, and as you're going to find as you look at it, and as Christina said, not every nice old property can possibly be found eligible in a historic survey, that with this group of tools, hopefully we can have a higher level of protection.
So is it too early to agendize that discussion, or is it?
No, well, it can be, it's in the document that you're reviewing, so we don't have to agendize it. It's just, ultimately, if you want to talk about it more, we're not going to have that much more to say than I think what's been in there. But if the commission supports that sort of thing, that would go forward in the recommendation to city council.
Okay.
City council then might say, well, what is this planning district? And we would kind of present it more thoroughly. And then if city council wanted to entertain that, they could call that out as something separate, and then we would prepare a report, talk about it more, and see if it got any traction.
Yeah, I think it would be great to have more information on it, or how do other cities handle those conservation districts, so we would know how we might be able to handle it.
Yeah, in my experience, I read about them more than I ever have seen them or experienced them. I think our consultants and members of the community might be able to pull together and find out. I'm not aware of any in the Los Angeles area.
A lot of them were identified in Survey LA, but I think they haven't figured out how to treat them yet. But that was a tool we were told to use in that survey, and I know there's a large number that were identified for that reason.
Okay, what we could do is we could talk to people in LA get the language that they used in Survey LA, see what the status is there. My guess is it's going to be a very slow process, but we'll see. At least to help you inform you about what's happening, regionally.
Yeah,
That'd be great.
that would be great.
And so then, in theory, I guess if they were created for South Glendale during this process, they could then be used elsewhere in the city. Is the idea, right?
They're not going to be created as part of this process. So the best we're going to get out of this survey is a recommendation that it's something to consider in the future.
Okay.
Like I said, this is an ordinance. This is kind of a big project. It's a new planning tool that we don't have right now, so we'd have to go through a whole process: planning commission, HPC, city council.
Got it. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to thank you very much. It's a very extensive report. I enjoyed immensely reading it, and it gives you a lot of, food for thought on everything, especially in South Glendale, because it's an area that has, as you've noted in the thing, changed so much over the years. And I won't do my bicycle thing, but it was an area that you could, and I had lots of friends that lived in that part of town, so I it's really great. I look forward to the revised one on it. I'm sure you got the letter from the Glendale Historic Society, so you're, in discussion with them, I hope, because they were asking that they could be allowed in on this, and I'm not advocating for them, but hint, hint,
They have a speaker card, so I'm sure.
Oh,
we'll be
okay.
there
Then I
as
will.
soon as we
I will not
wrap
say
up.
any more. But thank you very much, John, and everybody that worked on this thing. You get gold stars wherever they put gold stars in historic preservation. So,
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
You and your team.
Okay, Nick?
Thank you. I'd like to add my voice of approval. Thank you for everything that was said. It's a great report. It's very well written. And Jay touched on my one question regarding zoning. It's a great report with timelines and detail and progression as things went forward. And then I come to zoning changes have resulted in a great deal of infill construction. I would like to know those time changes, or put that context in the timeline as well.
Sure.
When did those zoning changes take place, and that might help describe these districts? And what are the current zoning for these areas?
Sure.
That'd be great.
We've already talked about on the map that HRG has produced. We'll at least have one version of that map that the city may actually produce, where we're going to have the zoning overlay, because that's going to be very
That would be
interesting
great.
to see. And we have a very brief answer about your question about zoning. Glendale messed up early on with its zoning decisions in the 1930s when we developed kind of a zoning ordinance. Almost the entire South Glendale area was zoned as multifamily, and so this checkerboard hodgepodge of big buildings, little apartment buildings, little houses, all next to each other on the same block, is a direct result of that. The downzonings occurred as community members, starting in the 70s, but I think it peaked in the 80s and 90s, were very concerned about the giant condo buildings that were just eating up blocks, and that's where the city started downzoning. And if you look at the zoning map, it's interesting. When you look at Brand Boulevard running down the center and Central, the zoning is very high density in a stripe that goes parallel to those streets and then kind of diminishes as you move away. Unfortunately, we have only a tiny amount of single-family zoned area in South Glendale. And when you think about our neighborhoods to the north and you look at what's on the street today, it's a direct result of that decision made in the 30s.
Thank you. I'd still like to see it, though.
Sure.
Yeah, no.
See, it's all about the 20s, but there's nothing in the 30s here. It goes to World War II. So that's nice to know. Thank you.
Do you have any
No,
comments,
I'm good. Thank you.
questions? Okay. Just a couple more questions for you. Curious about the database. You said you're handing the database over to the city. Is that database available to the public or to TGHS? Because it'd be a lot easier to look at this information in a database where you could sort by style, sort by year, sort by classification, pull up photos related to each one rather than going through, Excel spreadsheets with like minute font and referencing photos on separate pages. Just curious.
The database was not available during this preliminary phase, just because we use other tools when we're collecting information in the field, and we typically use the database to enter all the information and then produce the DPR form. So it's more of a final product. I appreciate what you're saying. I understand that it's a lot to wade through. We did try to put some fields in there to allow you to sort in those ways, and we're happy to do some more of that if it's helpful. The initial photographs not the version that you're seeing that are organized by address, but initially we did have them organized by property type, so you could open up and look at all the craftsmen together, for example. We can continue to do that if it's helpful. We still have it that way for our own purposes, so we're happy to try to work with you and make it a little easier. I'm not sure exactly when the database itself will be available or how that might be made available to people, just because it's, a particular software and et cetera.
Proprietary software? Or,
oh, no, but just not something that I think is easily shared.
Just online and all that.
Right,
right. In the contract with HRG, that's a final deliverable rather than an interim kind of phase. I hear what you're saying, and we might be able, staff has access to whatever the most recent version of it is. If the commission had specific requests to reorganize it by style or something else, we could help with that. So.
The other comment, which might be helpful, and again, I don't know the functionality of the database, but on the photo pages to have the classification codes added, so you could see.
You guys are killing me. Yes, I appreciate that too. So maybe we'll work with Jay and figure out if we can find some way to share the information that's a little more user-friendly. The photos are auto-generated, so the file name is what you're seeing there, which is why it's a little harder to then add additional data. But we're happy to talk to Jay to make this a little easier on everyone.
Yeah. And HRG is under contract, and they're working to a certain budget figure, and which means I think we are going to be inclined to help them do these kinds of things as much as possible. And since we're sharing the information, we'll be able to, as long as our technical expertise allows. Hopefully, Excel we can figure out.
Yes.
So, as questions come up, the idea of I'm not sure how to work the photo issue. That would be different than what we have access to. But reorganizing the database is actually pretty simple. So.
Okay. And then last, if you can take a look at the map on 24 and make sure that the naming of the potential historic districts and the potential planning districts match the names in the report. They're slightly different.
Sure. Yes, we will definitely
and I
do
did
that.
see the Cottage Grove extension on the
It's a
map
little blue
listed.
blip.
It's very small, so it might be too small to...
No, I can find where it is. I couldn't find it listed.
Oh, it's not in the list. Okay. We'll definitely make sure the map matches the findings.
Okay, that's all I have. Any other questions before we open up to public? No. Thank you again very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we'll open the public hearing, and we've got 2 speaker cards on this item. Who would like to go first? Greg Grammer.
Actually, could you hand me the keyboard, and then we'll set up your show? What? Yeah. Well, stay where you are. And then back in a second. And yours is the first here.
Good evening again. My name is Greg Grammer. I'm the president of the Glendale Historical Society. And on behalf of our organization and its more than 700 members, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to comment on the preliminary draft South Glendale Historic Resources Survey. As you know, TGHS has been advocating for such a survey for years. As Mr. Platt mentioned, reviewing and providing input on this survey is probably the most important task that this commission has had in years, and it is certainly a responsibility that we have taken very seriously. And the results, as you can imagine, will shape preservation and development in South Glendale for decades to come. A small team of TGHS volunteers has spent hundreds of hours over the last 2 months reviewing the initial draft survey to provide advanced comments to Historic Resources Group, city staff, and now to you. And we are grateful to the city and to HRG for this opportunity, and we look forward to working with them as this process continues. As we indicated in our letter, we have covered virtually every square foot of South Glendale, mostly on foot, identifying potential historic resources we thought might have been overlooked given HRG's daunting task of assessing nearly 9,000 parcels. We followed up on several hundred of them, and in the end, based on visual inspection, reviewing building permits, historic research, we submitted a list of approximately 160 properties that we believe should be added to the survey, primarily with the status code of 5S3, but also some as 6L, and those we believe should be upgraded from 6L to 5S3. And now I'd like to go over some of our recommendations, and we'll hit the highlights here. These are just a few examples of properties that have now been added to the survey after our feedback. These are 3 mid-century modern apartment buildings from the 1960s. Previously, the survey had only included 1 post-1950s apartment building as a 5S3. At the top is a minimal traditional garden apartment with streamlined modern features. And the Spanish Colonial Revival duplex is in Adams Hill. And at the bottom is a 1938 ranch duplex. And prior to our comments, there were no individual 5S3 ranch properties in the survey. One commercial building that was added at our recommendation was by a master architect of mid-century modern design, W.A. Sarmiento, and it is now included in the survey as eligible for both the Glendale and the California registers. And we were pleased that about 19 of our recommended properties have been added, but we have concerns about the underrepresentation of specific styles and building types, and that the survey is more restrictive than the criteria laid out in the historic context statement. Only 2 commercial buildings from 1940s were found eligible in the survey, and this streamlined modern building is not one of them, which frankly is kind of perplexing to us. It was found eligible for both the Glendale and the California registers in the city's 2006 adopted survey for downtown as one of the best commercial buildings from the 1940s in Glendale, and there have been no alterations since. So we'd like to see this one added. This is a rare 1941 streamlined modern industrial building, which is home to American Metaseal, which it's been home to since 1952. It was not initially in the survey, but it's now been added as 6L. 6L because it's not an early distinctive or associated with an important industry. We believe this building is architecturally distinctive, both in its own right and in comparison with the remaining industrial buildings in Glendale, which are generally quite altered. We think this one should be upgraded to 5S3, as there are no streamlined modern commercial or industrial buildings in the survey. This one is a rare 2-story streamlined modern brick commercial building, Suppose You Drive, which has been housed in Glendale since the building opened in 1947. Most of the historic fabric, as you know, on San Fernando Road has been destroyed. This was not in the initial survey, but now it is as 6L. We think the style is too rare for that and believe that it should be a 5S3. And not everything on San Fernando Road is pre-war. This striking, high-integrity 1964 corporate modern building was not in the survey, but we believe it should be. There are also no dingbats found as historic resources in the survey, although it is an important Southern California building type. This example shows how quirky the style can be with its folded plate detail, mosaic panels, and the pop-out on top. We think this should be a 5S3. And this is a charming minimal traditional courtyard apartment complex with French Revival elements from 1941. It's 6L in the survey. This seems to be a case where really a trivial alteration, the reversible security fence and gates, prevented it from being assigned a 5S3 status code. And just point out that the survey does note the rarity of the French Revival style in South Glendale. This Mediterranean Revival apartment building with some Art Deco influences. Some of the windows on the primary facade have been replaced, but the details of this building, notably the prominent chevron motif are rare, and there aren't many buildings like this in Glendale. A building only needs to preserve a majority of its character-defining features to be historic according to the historic context statement. It is listed as 6L in the survey, and we think it should be a 5S3. Triplexes, especially this nested variety, are even rarer than duplexes. There was only 1 triplex in the initial draft survey. This lovely minimal traditional example was added to the survey, but only as a 6L because of a large population in North Glendale. But having covered the whole of South Glendale, we know that minimal traditional triplexes are in fact exceedingly rare, and there are none designated in the survey, and this one should be. And now on to Craftsman Architecture. This one's from 1913. It was not in the survey initially, but after input it is now, but as a 6L. The composite siding has been covered or replaced the original wood, and while this is unfortunate, we don't think it should disqualify the property as a historic resource, as prescribed in the historic context statement. It preserves the majority of features that characterize its style. The directive knee braces, the subtly curved header, the modillions, and the tapered porch support and the jewel motif windows. This is a 1911 Craftsman with a very distinctive curved front gables and notably flared at the base. It is located in the Diamond District, and we are really happy that that tiny neighborhood, once populated with Charming Craftsman is now a candidate for a conservation district or a planning district. But individuals in that neighborhood deserve careful consideration. Only 2 houses in the entire neighborhood were found eligible, and that's just a sign, I guess, of how dire the alterations and demolitions have been. This house has had its windows replaced in original openings and 2 reversible wood screens and a security door added, but it is not in the survey. But given both the date of the construction and its distinctive character, we think it should qualify as a 5S3. This is a later house in the Diamond District, a 1922 Craftsman. It was surveyed as 6L with a comment that the door had been replaced, but that doesn't appear to be correct to us. The house seems to be perfectly intact and includes a nice open truss with natural stone piers. We think this one should be a 5S3, especially given the neighborhood context of altered craftsmen's. The photo on top is of an unusual 1919 Craftsman Duplex designed by Charles Shattuck, a celebrated and important architect here in Glendale. Duplexes are acknowledged as a rare resource type, but this was not in the initial survey, but later added as a 6L due to alterations in setting, presumably because of the driveway and the rear apartment building. But setting should not be a serious consideration for Glendale Register eligibility. As you see in the lower image, the proposed townhouses have not been found to compromise the historic resource at 512 West Doran. Same with the Good House, which is on the Glendale Register. Again, we believe that these high-integrity craftsmen, the top is from 1911, the 2-story Craftsman from 1922, and a 1915 duplex with reversible additions to the porch are either a 6L or not included in the survey. We fear that because they have apartments on the property, it's because of their setting, and we strongly suggest that these and similar properties be recognized a historic resource, as 512 West Doran has been. This is another Craftsman from 1912. It has reversible security bars and doors. It was given a status code of 6L because it was moved in 1923. But as you know, Craftsman bungalows were frequently moved to make way for development on the old site, which is part of its historic value. We think that it should be a 5S3. This is going through these rather quickly here, but this is a 1920 clipped Colonial Craftsman, a rare and special building type here in Glendale. It was found 5S3 in the initial survey that we had reviewed, but now for some reason it's been downgraded to a 6L. The reason was given was additions, but those additions were observed in the original survey, and they're from 1926, and any addition within 6 years of construction should not necessarily be disqualifying. This building has been proposed for demolition, and we would like to see it returned to the initial 5S3 status code. The Craftsman Houses here were built by Ruth and Ralph Byram, children of Glendale pioneer Ellis Byram, on part of his original farm and immediately adjacent to his house, which is visible in the upper left-hand corner. We consider these to be high-integrity properties. For their association with the Byram family, they illustrate the evolving presence and legacy of a pioneer family over half a century in Glendale. They were found to be 6L in the survey, but we think they should be changed to 5S3. These weren't included in the initial survey, but now they have been, but as 6L. It's a rare and distinctive craftsman built and occupied by Herman Nelson, a prominent business leader in early Glendale. He was a director, secretary, treasurer, and cashier of the Bank of Glendale, the city's first bank, organized in 1906. We believe it should be 5S3 for its architecture and its association with Nelson, despite alteration to some windows and a tiled porch. This is the Glendale Health Center. It has experienced some unfortunate alterations to doors and windows that appear to be unpermitted. It was designed by local architect Arthur Wolfe the same year he designed the county courthouse in Glendale, which is a mid-century masterpiece. We hope that you will agree that this magnificent building deserves to be a 5S3 despite the alterations. It wasn't included in the survey. The survey did pick up a number of outstanding ecclesiastical buildings, but missed this one. It's the Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall from 1966. It's a contemporary building with Googie influences, and we have nothing identified in the survey with Googie style. The rarity of the style is always a consideration in creating a survey, and the reversible gate here should be an issue. In sum, we ask that the Commission encourage HRG and city staff to meet with us to discuss our extensive research and recommendations and to go over the survey methodology. I think this was previously discussed, and it sounds like this is going to happen with the feedback that we provided, but we would like the Commission to urge the consultant to refer back to the historic context statement as a guide and to allow more flexibility in designation given the rarity of many architectural styles and building types here in South Glendale. And we asked that the staff start flagging properties now that have been identified by HRG in the survey to prevent the over-accountable approval for work that negatively impacts identified historic resources. We have been very thorough, deliberative, and conservative in our analysis. We don't believe that all old buildings are historic, not even all Craftsman's, but we do believe that the buildings we identified do warrant a closer look and further consideration on architectural and historical grounds, and in some cases because they reflect Glendale's early heritage. I'd like to give a shout out to our Vice President, Catherine Yurka, who really put her heart and soul into this project, to Sharon Bursell, who has done extensive research on the homes, and to Francesca Smith, our resident architectural historian. Thank you very much for your time, your consideration, and input. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you hand that back?
Okay, we have an additional speaker card. Francesca Smith.
Could you hand that up? Thank you. Momentarily.
We'll see.
Okay, here you go.
I only have 6 slides. It was about 24, so I'll go as quickly as possible.
Okay.
Hi. Thank you. I'm Francesca Smith. I'm a principal architectural historian at a state agency, and I have more than 30 years of experience doing this, doing local surveys, probably more than 30 in California and in other states, including Texas, Utah, Nevada. Those have all really met with a lot of success, except in one case I can think of. And that was where I inherited a local survey, and my predecessors hadn't coordinated with the local historical society. I'm on the second paragraph. Okay. One of the most important foundations in preparing a local survey in practice in state and federal guidelines is the inclusion of and coordination with local historical groups. In the case where my firm had not coordinated with the local historical groups, that giant reconnaissance survey of a pretty important town in California remains a draft because the local historical organization has never endorsed it and fights it to this day. It does neither the city nor the community any service to do it that way. So these are National Register. This is a National Register Bulletin on preparing local surveys, and you'll see how many times it mentions how important it is to work in conjunction with local historical societies. We have volunteered our opinions and our time and put our foot in the door, and we have met with lots of cooperation now, but we also have all spent hundreds of hours doing this and having to double-check, learn the methodology, learn the registration criteria that were in the South Glendale survey. And as a professional architectural historian, I will tell you I find them excessively restrictive. For instance, the Glendale Register has no requirements for integrity stated in the ordinance whatsoever, but you'll notice that the requirements for physical integrity described in these are more restrictive than the National Register, the National Historic Landmark Program, and, of course, the Glendale Register. You'll see here the top photo is the Sam and Alfreda Maloof residence. It was listed in the National Register in 1910. It was altered nearly every year, including its relocation to a new, entirely 3 miles away location until Sam's death. It was nonetheless listed in the National Register. Jay, I know you must know the Frick Collection in the middle. It's a National Historic Landmark. NHLs can be modestly modified, not during the period of significance. That one is, the period of significance ended in 1935, and since that time, mechanical pavilions have been added, and an entrance addition, and an entirely new addition in 1977, and that was nonetheless listed as a National Historic Landmark, which is higher than the National Register. You probably know the bottom building, which is El Miradero, the Brand Library. That building was converted to a library in 1956. It received a gallery edition in 1969 and is nonetheless listed in the Glendale Register. So we're not doubting the intentions of our colleagues who are doing this work. It's a ton of work, but we think that the registration criteria are overly restrictive, and they disagree between the methodology, which is normally submitted in the beginning and vetted heavily by the client, and the survey registration criteria in the big document. They don't exactly agree. So when we tried to use those, we weren't quite sure which one meant the most, and how a property that's been altered during what is likely its period of significance, how that makes it not locally eligible is beyond me. I've probably evaluated, it sounds preposterous, more than 100,000 buildings in the United States for federal projects, so this isn't my first time. We ask that, and we know that HRG is trying to consider our additions, but we submitted more than 160, and we vetted these. We went through these. We spent very sweaty Saturdays walking up and down streets, trying to learn our way around and trying to follow the methodology, whichever it was, trying to come up with this. We even had on our website a publicly accessible thing where people could add their ideas, and we vetted those and culled them down a long way. So far, very few have been added. A lot were downgraded from what we recommended, and our recommendations weren't arbitrary or capricious. They were based on what the Glendale Register says and what whichever methodology or survey registration we were looking at the time said. They don't always agree. I had one that showed them in opposition to one another, but it was too boring and complicated. Not that you wouldn't get it, it was just boring and complicated. So also, the surveys that I have done, by the way, have been intensive. They resulted in 2-page DPR forms that were adopted by the cities or by the federal agencies, and they contained a great deal of information. I will say, for a reconnaissance survey that is so restrictive, this is producing a lot of information, but we remain hopeful that all of the properties that we have submitted will be added to the survey. What we're asking, what I'm asking, is that the city direct the consultant to meet with TGHS, those people, for constructive discussions regarding significant properties, and to ask the staff through the consultant for written clarification why the registration criteria in a reconnaissance survey would be more restrictive than national or local requirements, and how different components of this very survey disagree with other parts. Thank you so much. That's it. Oh, and the third one, I'm going with, we don't need it.
I can't see it.
I think we're going to do that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have one additional speaker card on this topic, that's Patty Null.
Hi, my name is Patty Knoll. I live at 1847 Gardena, and I guess I'm the cheerleader for the Diamond District. I would ask you to wrestle with this idea of a planning district. Old houses, by definition, in South Glendale and other working class neighbors are cheap houses. They're affordable houses. And the Diamond District suffered terribly, I guess, from the bad zoning you mentioned. There are a number of bad apartment buildings that went in. But there's still a couple of blocks that hold the integrity of Craftsman. But the windows have been changed, and I looked up the permits during this process. They were not permitted. Some are, some aren't, because that's the kind of neighborhood it is. And if you live in an old house, the first thing to go are the windows. And if you'd like to keep your heat in and your air conditioning out, the temptation to go down to Home Depot and get a new window and stick it in. But the old cobble stonework is still there. The funky little roof lines are there, so you saw. And the block is still there. When you drive down, it looks like a Craftsman neighborhood. So I can understand how hard this is to wrestle, but that neighborhood is coming under pressure again because it's a transit-oriented district. And huge apartment buildings are going up. On San Fernando, the Triangle is going in. And we now have the neighborhood welcomes and is dealing with Essentia, low-cost housing apartments, Vassar City Lights. All these pressures are coming in on the neighborhood because that's where you can get in. And I would hope that you guys take a look at how to hold a neighborhood together and keep its character, because that's what I don't want lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we'll close the public hearing. And are there any other comments?
And we had discussed with the consultant, if you would like, she's prepared to kind of address some of the points that were made, but then if you have other questions between Christine and I, we could. So.
We'll open the public hearing again and have you come back and address.
Well, we had discussed this before the hearing. I'm not sure if there's any particular points that I want to address right now. Okay. I think, like I said, we're relooking at things. We're still in the preliminary phases, so we're happy to work together and figure out the final findings.
Yeah.
Okay. So
work together.
Yeah.
Are we safe in assuming that HRG is willing to meet over a table with TGHS as they have requested?
Well, I would say, from our part, we answer to the city, so I'm happy to work with the city as our client in the way that they think is appropriate moving forward.
Yeah, and I think it's unusual to have the direct face-to-face meeting. We're not opposed to it necessarily. The only thought I have is that it privileges the city's advocacy group over other citizens who may have interests similar, and we probably wouldn't be meeting with every similar interest group. And we do think this is and will continue to be a very public process where we are being responsive to the TGHS comments. One thought based on their recommendation would be we could run this, and I haven't given this a lot of thought, we could talk to the city attorney to see if there was any thought that having that kind of direct communication with the advocacy group most likely to be interested, although I shouldn't say that because I think there are a number of other groups that would also be very interested in the findings of the survey. And the issue here is we gave TGHS the first crack at it because we knew they would be able to put the most effort into it and have the most kind of cogent response based on, just as preservationists. But I certainly don't see a problem moving it up the ladder to see if that is a problem, and we would also have additional costs for HRG because that's not built into our contract, but we can work that out possibly through further contract negotiation.
Jay, it seems to me that would be fair. I'm sure there are other groups in the community that would have an interest, but I feel that considering the sheer amount of time and effort that our, historical preservation advocacy group has put into this effort would probably count for something.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Otherwise, we can close the pub.
I do have a question. So Ms. Smith mentioned that in other experiences in her case where she's worked on surveys and things, they have consulted with advocacy groups and whatnot. In the Survey LA or some of the other ones that HRG has done, what interaction have you had with advocacy groups in those surveys?
It depends on the city, and like I said, we follow the lead of our client, who is always the city. So it varies by community. For Survey LA, we did open meetings for anyone in the area to come and talk to us about the survey. So it wasn't just advocacy groups, but property owners, other interested stakeholders. It just depends on the nature of the survey and how the city determines that it's best to outreach with the groups.
And so this is all, I believe now, this is an open comment period. The comments are given directly to you guys, staff, is that right?
City, sure. Yeah.
And then do you filter them through and give them to HR or do
no,
you just kind of dump it in their lap and
it over.
let them deal with it? Okay.
And then together we look at them,
Yeah.
but they're getting the full extent of the comments.
But at this point, there wouldn't necessarily be direct communication between them and anybody that makes a comment, regardless of their advocacy level.
Well,
at this point,
not. Yes, no.
Okay.
The issue is, it's like, is it going to be like, okay, let's fight over this one, and then let's talk about this one, let's fight over that one, and that ultimately isn't that productive and is incredibly time-consuming. The idea of a broader community meeting, similar to what LA's done, is something that we could also talk about, which could be another contract amendment. But and I'm just really curious to talk to our city attorney to see just what their thoughts are before we commit to doing something. That may seem like I'm trying to be an obstructionist, but I don't feel that way. No. I think ultimately this is the time to do it. Prior to tonight, this is the public debut of a multi-month public review process. So if we're going to find ways, and in general, community outreach for all of our programs, whether it's pedestrian plan or anything else, it's very hard to reach everybody. In fact, it's impossible to reach everybody. We do know there are certain stakeholders who are going to be more interested. So, for example, I imagine that the Chamber of Commerce, realtors, homeowners groups, different groups may be interested in this. A lot of people were noticed about this meeting who have not chosen to come, but that doesn't mean they won't decide to come at a later meeting. So I think we can also, when we talk to the city attorney about that, we'll also discuss internally the idea of like what kind of broader meeting can we have, and see how much traction or how many participants we can get.
So short of that.
Any more questions for Christine?
Go ahead. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
This is a draft, and I think set in stone, Jay said. When is your report set in stone? You presented this tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Now what do you do with it next? Step 2, step 3, until the final step?
Don't we do?
Sure.
Ultimately, this is it's ultimately the city's decision rather than the consultants. We're moving this through the public process as part of the draft South Glendale Community Plan. So because this is an addendum to the plan, it's going to be reviewed by the Planning Commission. It's going to be brought to the Historic Preservation Commission as part of the South Glendale Plan, totally different than what we're doing tonight. And then it's ultimately ratified by City Council when they review the entire document.
But her contract, because we're talking about extra cost with extra groups, what does your contract say with this report?
In terms of when the final product?
Yeah. What do you do next under your contract?
Well, I would say the next thing under our contract is the continued revision of the survey data. So we had built into our contract a couple rounds of review with city staff and the city, and then finalizing things along the way. So we actually did not have a deadline for completing the survey because it's tied to this larger EII process. So we wanted to make sure we were in step with that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Well, just a question. So TGS sends you 90 properties, and then and Mr. Grammer just came along and said, well, they didn't approve this and this and this. These are all 6Ls, and we think they should be 5S3s. Mm-hmm. Do they have any recourse? I mean, do you re-listen to it? If you determine that it's a 6L, do you ever go back and revisit that property again? I mean, what was their recourse if there are properties that they really think are 5S3s that you don't feel are?
I can answer that from my perspective, and then Jay's probably the better authority for that. Like I said, because this is still a process and we're still looking at properties, we understand that they still have questions, and we looked at the properties they provided in August. We made some preliminary recommendations so they could be included in the data that was given to you tonight. We haven't done any vetting of the second list that they gave us because we were preparing to come here.
Right.
So everything, we're still looking at things. I'm not sure how it's ultimately going to play out. And I will say, again, it isn't just HRG. We've been working with staff along the way to discuss the methodology, to look at groups of properties with them. We've done that with some of the TGHS properties to date, just to get their feelings on some of these additional properties. So I know that isn't really an answer to your question, but we are still looking at things.
And part of the process is going to be TGHS has submitted our 2 rounds of recommendations. There may be more coming, I'm not sure. And they're presenting them to the commission, so they're now part of the public record. Anyone looking at the public record, and particularly the commission, should be looking at those and saying, do I agree? Do I disagree? Ultimately, you will be making a recommendation which can come down to a property-specific recommendation. We don't know what we're going to hear from you. But the city's attitude, and I think the attitude of cities in general with surveys, is that we defer to every city gets the survey that has specific conditions that lead to different methodologies and different thresholds for significance. We believe that through HRG and the work they did on the context, we've come up with a very defensible, very rational way to look at these properties. And with the submittal the first submittal we received from TGHS, we looked at some things and it was like, there were some things that frankly had been missed in the survey. We looked at it and we said, no survey's perfect, we understand that, and that of course is a resource. We have some that we were like, oh, we hadn't thought about that angle. The deeper research might add a layer that makes us think differently about something. And there are others that we frankly just disagree about. My policy from the staff level is that after all these discussions are done and we take into account what the commission says, what other members of the public say, where TGHS ends up, and ultimately even where council ends up. I don't know that they're going to be pinpointing anything, but that's part of the process. Mm-hmm. We have to make a decision at some point. So we're not going to just say everything that people say is important is going to make it into the survey, but we're going to do our best to assess those against the criteria and the methodology and be consistent to the greatest degree that you can in a survey.
Okay. So would we be making our property-specific recommendations presumably at the next presentation in October, or
I think
how
you're
will
going to
that
have a lot
work?
of time to do this. I think it would be great if you could, to the greatest degree possible, look over everything. I can help you, like I said, kind of get the data or the spreadsheet ordered in a way that's a little more usable for you. We can talk to HRG about whether they could put status codes on the photos, how quickly or easily that could be done and at what cost. And hopefully by the October 19th meeting, we could get some property-specific feedback and also just feedback about the methodology. You heard some questions about integrity and other methodology issues. Those are things worth discussing publicly. So October would be great, but we're going to have another crack at it. What I picture is the next 2 to 3 meetings, we're going to be able to discuss this publicly in an agendized format with public input. And in addition to that, separately, which I'll talk about as one of the updates, you will also be reviewing the community plan. The community plan document weaves aspects of the heritage of Glendale into the document so that we can see, and it's similar to the North Glendale Community Plan, which the Commission did review, and I can't remember how many of you looked at that, but the idea is that gives you yet another crack at talking about the survey because that's part of the document. We're hoping there you can focus on the document itself, but if there's still things you want to talk about, we're here to listen and take comments.
So one more just question, just for clarification. And I don't know who this should go to. TGHS is requesting an additional 160 properties be added to the survey, either with a 5S3, a 6L, or be changed from 6L to 5S3. Do you have that list now, and has it been looked at, or is that something you're still looking at?
I think we do.
That's the one you just got?
Yeah. So but we received about half of it in August, and then the rest of it in September. So we've looked at about half of them.
Yeah, and I think some of them they made some changes based on that list already.
Yes.
So I guess
On the first list they received, yeah.
again, at a high level for me, And Jay, to your point that there's going to be back and forth by both, groups, and that on some things there just isn't going to be agreement. So I just, again, at a really high level, I'm looking at 8,500 properties. That was sort of your universe. HRG identified 383 as eligible. TGHS is asking for an additional 160. And when you add those numbers up, it comes to less than, to about 6% of 8,500. Mm-hmm. So that, in my view, means that 94% of the properties can be demolished or changed. So it seems like a small number to add if those are considered important.
General,
and I understand, criteria and all of that.
So
but
6% is a high number for cities eligible historic resources. 6Ls will kind of broaden that number. When I worked in New York, they were just at 1% and moving up from there. Obviously a much bigger pool. I don't know where Survey LA came out, if we have that number.
I don't know.
And ultimately we're not moving toward any number. We're looking to see what is defensible under the methodology and the criteria that we've established. And there is a point when the decision will be made, but it's many months from now, and we're going to get all the feedback we can.
Understood. In my opinion, it still leaves 94% of properties unprotected.
So if
Plenty of room
Cities
for
move.
development.
Cities change.
Understood.
And so if in our discussions, if during our discussions we have serious comment about, say, methodology or criteria, things like that, is it feasible or possible that staff could ultimately then redirect HRG to loosen its guidelines or tighten them or change them or whatever we kind of come up with, at which point maybe some other properties would then be brought into the fold? Or are we really talking about specifically hashing out specific properties?
We are open to all recommendations. We can't tell you or guide you in what your concerns are. At staff level, we're very comfortable with the way HRG's approached this. They've taken a very detailed look at it. They bring the experience that they've gained through all of their other survey work. I would like the survey to be comparable to the best practices of our profession, while at the same time recognizing that we have differences. One of the key differences is our 6L properties that other cities don't have, that we're affording this higher level of protection. That alone is a good thing that's taking us to a Glendale-specific kind of conception. Even the way we're dealing with 6Ls now, which may not be enough, and we can certainly enhance it, is that higher level of review. And in those, and this is the problem, the commission itself has looked at beautiful properties and said, we're sorry, that beautiful property is not eligible for the Glendale Register.
Right.
Usually the ones you see are pretty grand houses that have alterations. What we're experiencing in the field through the survey is there are a lot of modest properties that were lived in by regular old people over the years. And I know the Historical Society agrees with this, and we may have individual kind of points of disagreement, but that doesn't make it historically eligible. And a lot of the things that I'm looking at, even some of the things that we're finding as fives, maybe 3 years ago, if someone had nominated some of the garden apartment buildings that we're looking at, I would have said, we'll bring it to the commission, but I'm not sure. It's not jumping out at me. Now that we're looking at it as a collective and we're looking at it, all at the same time, I think we're finding, there's some really interesting patterns that we have here, and we want to protect the best examples of those. But at the same time, I don't think we should be elevating mediocre examples of a style just because we don't have others. I think we should be really thinking like this is, that's like grade inflation or something. So
grading on a curve.
Yeah. Which doesn't mean there are a few of the brick streamlined moderne, for example, I look at and I say, or the white brick, and I'm like, that building has some interest, so that's something we'll be talking about, just to bring up one specific example. But ultimately we're relying on HRG's professional expertise to kind of level all of this.
So, a question about the 160 properties. if there's discussion back and forth, through the city from TGHS to HRG, and there's difference of opinions, would it not be fair enough to say that the city should make that recommendation along with, say, the influence of the commission, because ultimately we're the stewards of our city? Earlier you had said that HRG has the ultimate decision. So could you speak to that?
Ultimate's too big of a word for that. Obviously, the commission has a lot of say in this, but what I don't think is going to happen is if HRG has a strong reason to think that this is violating the methodology that they've developed, I don't think we should, even if the majority of the commission thinks that should be on the list. But then the case can be made if, it really depends on, that part's going to be case by case. So I don't want to make it sound like the commission or anyone is completely shut out of the process.
Okay.
But that reminds me. That reminds me of something you said earlier, and I don't know exactly what that pertained to. That I think at the next meeting you would have a list of reasons why certain properties were rejected. I guess.
Yes.
So would that be everything that was rejected?
No, and this was a distinction I was waiting to make in case the question came up. So, like I said, our work plan and our contract with the city initially said we would identify and document eligible historic resources and 6L properties. But in the course of doing this work, based on looking at the previous surveys that had a number of things that were eligible in a previous survey that may have been altered since that time and now are no longer eligible, or things that we don't feel are eligible that have been recommended to us by the Historical Society, or, debates and discussions we've had with city staff, we thought it was valuable to provide you with information of those properties that were looked at in detail and we determined were not eligible for one reason or another. Sometimes it's not really obvious to the eye, but then once you look at the Sanborn map, you realize this was a one-story house and now it's 2 stories, even though it looks pretty nice. Or that's just an example. But there are things that we discovered through research that we think might help with the discussion. So typically that's not part of our deliverable, but we decided that we would provide that in this case to help. There is still going to be thousands of properties that don't have that level of detailed research that won't be on the list, but we'll provide a list of everything that we looked at and determined was not eligible after that initial windshield phase.
Could we request that the 160 be provided, notes either added, elevated?
That's already being done.
Yes, we
So
do.
the
We
160
yes
for sure.
Yep.
Okay.
We have started that already, and we'll do that for the second round.
Yeah, any rationale is going to be very clear, as well as the rationale, as Christine said, for these 6Z properties, which is above and beyond what any survey gets. So.
Okay, any other questions for
Just-
Christine?
No,
I have a question for Greg.
Okay, then we can close the public session.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
No, it's okay. Allison.
I have just one.
I'm sorry, I want to open the public hearing again. Greg, would you mind? I guess there's a question for you or TGHS.
It's just very quick.
Yes,
Are you guys done?
we're done.
Okay.
We are done.
That's what I wanted to know. So the 160 is 160, and
Unless something comes to our attention. But no, I think we're done. I think we're done.
thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Okay, thank you.
That's good news.
Okay, now we'll close the public hearing.
Identify, yes, we're not.
Oh, you're not done? Yeah.
That's what I meant. Identify.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any?
Well, just one
questions
for Jay,
staff?
just to confirm, the staff, right? So they're getting, starting tomorrow, or even prior to today,
Tomorrow?
Tomorrow.
No promises there.
the staff is going to look at anything that is a 6L that HRG has indicated, or 6L, excuse me.
We're going to put the holds on in our database system that the planners at the counter use as soon as we possibly can. I can't say tomorrow that that's going to happen. Our staff is pretty well versed in knowing when to ask questions and when not to, but I will frankly admit that doesn't always happen, and things have, and I'm sure will continue to happen that don't give us all pleasure. But
Okay.
the holds will be a big help. And after tonight's hearing, we have kind of the official kickoff that allows us to do that, just like we're putting holds on in our pending historic districts. We don't do that when the nomination comes in. We do it after the first round, the first hearing with HPC. And we've done that for our 2 pending districts.
So Jay, on the holds, those are just a flag for the person at the counter. They don't have to go through you or your...
The flag generally brings it to me, to Deepika. We have other staff people who are comfortable with historic resources.
So it will presumably always go back to somebody
There's
in
a
the
very limited number
preservation.
of people who can take the holds off to allow the permit to be
Right.
ultimately processed. A highly guarded and limited number of people can do that. So.
Okay.
And so what happens if one of these properties comes to you at this specific stage? I mean, is it dependent on what it's coming to you for, or?
We've already gotten requests. Is this property historic? I want to develop the site. We are still telling people in this interim period where we haven't finalized the survey, we're doing what we did before. If it was identified in the Craftsman survey as a 6L or higher, obviously higher, we don't. 5s are very easy for us to deal with. All 6Ls from the Craftsman survey, if someone comes in to demolish it tomorrow, we're asking for a historic assessment from a consultant. If we get that report and we review it and we say it looks like they did their research, we don't have any reason to disagree with this, we're going to move them forward in the process. We still have the belt and suspender issue of TGHS coming in after they review that document and saying we don't think that consultant really found everything that's out there, or we disagree with their finding. So that's for Craftsman in particular. For a lot of these other properties, we don't have a system in place. But through our design review, our staff are very well versed. Windows are being replaced. We have to talk about that more thoroughly. Demolition, we know we have to talk about that. And demolition doesn't typically come in unless there's a project proposed for the site, which is going to go through more public review. Exemptions at the counter, that's where the holds will actually. Exemptions mean there's no other level of design review besides what's happening at the counter or just internally with staff. That's where the holds will be most valuable.
Okay. Just a little bit, still curious about the process, sorry. Yeah. So because in this case, the 6L flag is put on there because of this historic survey, would any of that, are there circumstances where any project or something that someone's proposing would be directed to this commission, or no?
For a 6L?
Yeah.
No. Well, it depends on what the project is. I can't say one way or the other.
But so it's not like a historic district where if someone wanted to do something to their house in the historic district, instead of going before design review, they come to us.
Right.
It's not like that.
And I misspoke. The commission's purview by ordinance is for designated properties, for historic district properties. Unless the ordinance were changed, we wouldn't be bringing anything to you that is kind of a property identified in the survey that hasn't been designated. If City Council at some point wants to change that,
I see.
Then right now Design Review Board has authority over that, and we have 3 levels of review that we mentioned at the last hearing. We have the exemption, which is the over-the-counter permit, which still gets design review by staff. We have the administrative design review process that we talked about in depth last month, and then we have the Design Review Board that would look at larger scale projects that either have bigger interventions that have more likelihood of affecting the historic eligibility of the resource, or wholesale demolition for new construction projects. Most new construction projects are going to the board. Oh, I shouldn't say that, or administrative reviews. So there's a public review level at all of that kind of higher level work.
So it is possible then we could perhaps, as a commission, lobby council to say, look, if there's a 6L or a 5S, well, you said those are pretty automatic and easy, but if there's a 6L because of historic situation, right? It's not necessarily designated, but it's part of a historic survey. We could maybe lobby the commission could maybe lobby the city council to make it so that it was sent down the historic track rather than just a traditional design review track.
The commission can lobby the council any which way, and that would be fine. For 6Ls, our 6Ls are not historic resources under CEQA, so there would be absolutely no reason for the commission to be looking at a 6L, and
despite the fact that it's put on there because of a historic reason.
Right, but it's not at that point. It's not a historic resource reason. There's a reason for the city to warrant special consideration in planning, is how it's written as a 6L, and that's this higher level of design review that we're getting in Glendale. So we are tuning our survey specifically to the needs of the city. That said, we're not going to have as many 6Ls, particularly with Craftsmen, as we had in the Craftsman survey. Craftsman Survey was very indiscriminate in, I shouldn't use a harsh word like that, but the Craftsman Survey, there are points of disagreement with how 6Ls were laid out for the craftsmen in that survey, so that could change.
Okay, I'm done.
Any other final comments?
Nope.
So in just closing, I just wanted to say once again, thank you so much to TJHS for your extensive work hours of effort. And it's one thing to do that when you're being paid. It's one thing to do that as a volunteer and your entire staff. And I appreciate the seriousness you take of Glendale and its historic properties. And so we really want to say thank you to you. I want to say thank you also to HRG for being open to comments and feedback. It's not always easy to take constructive criticism or opinions of others when you're a professional, and I've been on both sides. I understand that. So I wanted to say thank you for also taking feedback and also for embracing the second report provided by TJHS and comments here that might come from commission or staff. And so we look forward to a lot of camaraderie in this final phase of determining what should really be part of the historic resources. So thank you.
And I concur with everything Chair Shire had to say.
Yes.
Thank you all.
So with that, we will move on to our next agenda item, which is 8A, an update on community meeting regarding the proposed South Cumberland Heights and Casa Verdugo Historic Districts.
And before, I forgot to mention earlier, but if anyone is watching this and jotting down things, the entire survey document, including the narrative section, the photographs, and the spreadsheet, is available to the public. It's available at the website that I have up on the screen. If our friends over at GTV6 could cut to the screen. If they're listening.
Here, we'll write it on a piece of paper.
We have a delay.
Write it on a piece of paper.
There we go. Thank you. I'll just read it out loud, even though it's ridiculous. HTTP, well, we don't need that. www.ci.glendale.ca.us/government/packets, plural, /HPC_092.117/7A.pdf. What I would like to do ultimately, because this is going to be a long review process, is put this in a more prominent location on the city webpage. We don't have as much access to change that as we used to have, so I have to kind of figure that out, but I'll make a note to do that as soon as possible to get that up there.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to item 8A, I just wanted to let the commission know and let the public know that we are holding a community meeting next week for our two pending historic districts. Because we're trying to move them forward in the process together, we're having this initial meeting. This is our first outreach of several to the community, and we're bringing both neighborhoods together for the meeting. It will be held on Wednesday, September 27th this year, starting at 6:30, running till 8 o'clock or until the questions die out. And it's going to be held in this room, in Municipal Services Building, the hearing room, room 105. The way this was noticed is we send out a written notice to every property owner within the two historic districts, every property owner within a 500-foot radius of the boundary of the districts, and then we send out a second notice for many people, but we send it to the occupants because we have many absentee landlords. So we want occupants to have hear what's happening in the neighborhood. Ultimately, only property owners have a say in the ultimate petitioning and what we think of as kind of the vote for the district. But everyone can have a say at the point in talking about the district, what it means. And the reason we do the buffer for this first meeting is to hear from people who may be outside the district or inside who think the boundary's not right. They may want to expand the boundary, they may want to shrink the boundary, and we take that into consideration as we move forward. So we're going to talk about what a historic district is, what the process is from this point forward to ultimate designation, if that actually happens. And then we're going to talk about what happens in a district. How do we do design review, give people example, let them know what the expectations are for property owners in a district, what the regulations are, what we don't regulate, and basically kind of do a dispassionate overview of what this means. The primary reason we do this is to answer questions. So we'll have a brief presentation for each district, go over the basics, and then hear from the community. So Wednesday, September 27th, next Wednesday at 6:30 in this room in Municipal Services.
Great.
That meeting's not broadcast, correct?
That's not broadcast, yeah. That's not an official public meeting, but it's part of the ordinance-required outreach to the community.
Okay, next, 8B.
B. This is, I wanted to just let you know a bit about the schedule for the South Glendale Community Plan. I think Eric already gave you an idea of what that schedule is. When I put this on the agenda, I wasn't sure how far back it was being pushed, and we're still not sure. But we'll definitely keep the commission posted. We won't have it ready for, most likely, for the October meeting, for the presentation to the commission.
And our hope is to have the EIR and everything ready out for public at that point and bring that to you guys, just so you get an idea of what's in the plan and what the EIR evaluation was of that plan. And beyond that, it's going to go to several different boards and commissions for public input on that here. So it's going to be, we're looking at a series of probably like 6 meetings.
Yeah, but HPC is one of the steps along that pathway with the other boards and commissions.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, no questions?
No questions?
I wanted to give you a briefing, which I should have done over the years every time this happens, but I haven't. But we had a very interesting hearing with the City Council a couple of weeks ago for the recent Glendale Register nominations. So I just kind of wanted to give you an overview. Oh, I have to open this up to full screen.
Ross.
So the Beggs House on Ross Street, classic no-brainer in our world, was voted for Glendale Register designation and a Mills Act contract, which we'll begin working on in a month or so. Casa Verdugo also made it through with ease. Majestic Way, 1524 Majestic Way, made it through with somewhat less ease because there was some discussion about whether this rises to the level of the Glendale Register. I believe the commission itself had some back and forth discussion on this property, and I myself wasn't totally set on it initially until I went on my site visit, and that kind of helped me kind of change kind of what I found to be exciting and eligible in this property. The council ultimately voted unanimously to designate this, but there was discussion, and I think what's important for the commission is to get the feedback from council. It may or may not inform your future decision-making on properties, but I think it will help us as we work with applicants, let people know where we might see some kind of issues where, regardless of whether the Preservation Commission is inclined to recommend designation, the council may find otherwise, which is always the case, but in the past we haven't had many decisions that differ from your recommendation. So,
What was the date of that meeting in case people want to see it?
2 Tuesdays ago. Was that the 12th? I can't remember, and that's...
We can look.
Yeah, it was the 12th.
Yeah. So that was
2 Tuesdays.
No, we're here. 1, 2.
Oh, I'm looking at the wrong.
Oh, I actually got that. That's not how my brain usually works. So
Good job.
That's
Nice.
great. Yeah. If you remember, the Hathaway House on Mountain Street is the house that had a significant number of replacement windows on all facades. Council took issue with that and was very concerned about the extent of the Mills Act for the number of windows. Council did not designate this house. And that was kind of a borderline one as we came into the commission, and our staff recommendation acknowledged that this was kind of a little beyond what we've seen in some cases. But, what's that? I believe it was unanimous. And
Can I speak about that one?
Sure.
I do think it's worth going back and watching the deliberations among council members, particularly on this house, I'm a little bit concerned that perhaps some council members or maybe weren't quite prepared enough for this particular night or something. There just was some pushback on whether or not significant changes were made, and I'm not sure that the defense of the I'm not making a comment about you guys, but I'm not sure there was enough defense of the property in this case for designation. There seemed to be this understanding that a grand amount of changes had been made, and it really don't think that there were that many changes made to this property, but the impression by some on the council was that a lot of changes had been made. And the windows are a lot of changes, but the homeowners had agreed to fix those and change those. So this house, and even the next one too, there was an impression that a lot of changes had been made by one council member in particular, and I don't think that that was the case, and I'm afraid that perhaps more effort needs to be made for those points to be put out there so that they really do understand that.
Yeah, ultimately staff is more limited in a city council environment than we are here, where we have a lot more free-flowing discussion. We did, or Deepika was able to discuss there was kind of a small, what we thought was a infill addition at the rear corner of the house. When Deepika and I kind of debriefed afterwards, and there had been some sort of redwood deck at the rear that had been permitted and then removed, or was kind of a confusing history there. We wondered if possibly that kind of made the council member in particular think that more changes had happened there than really had. I was concerned going into the Historic Preservation Commission meeting that this might be pushing the envelope in terms of historic fabric and the types of replacements, the number of replacements. So I wasn't.
Maybe you weren't as shocked. I guess you weren't shocked then necessarily.
Well, there's always room to be shocked for various reasons.
Yeah,
but this
surprised, I should say.
This didn't surprise me because I had my own hesitations going in.
Okay.
If that the staff report for this house going to HPC was different than a typical staff report, because it was kind of like this house would not qualify for the register in its current condition and could only qualify with Mills conditions. Many of our other houses where we're replacing a couple of windows here and a garage door there, those changes haven't so affected the integrity of the property that it wouldn't qualify even if you didn't put those conditions on. And in the past, the commission rarely applied conditions. It's something in the last 7-8 years, something like that. So I appreciate the idea that what can staff do once things start moving in a certain direction, but I think we're basically relaying your recommendation at that point. It's not staff kind of defending the commission's decision. So up to a point, we have that ability to clarify things and make sure that they're hearing as much accurate information as possible.
Okay.
And then, perhaps most interestingly of all, we have the property on Vista Del Mar, which didn't give anyone pause for the house, and I think it didn't give the council pause for the house, but one of the council members became concerned about the wall at the street and whether that was original or not and whether that met code. This is an issue that predates this nomination. This is going back to something that predates my time with the city, so it's over 10 years ago. There was a huge issue with walls and fences and the setbacks of houses. And the city did a big survey of properties citywide that had wall and fence issues. There were enforcement and code issues. In general, just to explain the code, in the front setback, you're not allowed to put a wall or a fence that's over 18 inches high. And here, obviously, we have a wall that's 3.5 feet high or so. So one of the council members was concerned that there was kind of a disconnect between what we were trying to do with this fence and wall issue, the code, and what we see here. To be honest, when we went out to visit the site, we kind of walked through that gateway and didn't focus on the wall. I couldn't answer the question that was asked, is this wall original? I said it's likely that something was there because there's a significant drop-off from street level to the pad level for the house. I couldn't say this was there. So the council decided to continue the item. So we're going to do more staff research. We're going to pull all the permits. We're going to review the fence and wall survey that was done in 2005 or 6, whenever. We're going to go out to the site and look at physical evidence on this wall to see if we can kind of make any kind of judgment on that. When I look at it, my best guess is it might not be original to the house. And also the homeowner has the original blueprints. My memory and her memory is that this area wasn't on the blueprints, so she might not have a site plan.
Yeah.
So we're going to do the best we can to get as much information as possible. We're going to put it in the context of other walls and fences that are what we call legal non-conforming situations, where they were built before the code changed. There was concern by the council member about, well, what does that mean? If someone takes this down, will they be able to put a wall back up? So we're going to do our best to answer all of these things. They asked us to return on November 7th, I think. So we'll get the research done in the next few weeks, prepare a staff report, and go back.
Could any of those old, aerial maps?
Yeah, we'll look at those also.
That might help.
Yeah, Sanborns wouldn't show it, but aerials could. Hillside aerials,
Harder.
yeah, although if the tree coverage is what it is today, it's not too horrible, so it's possible. So we'll do our best to get to the bottom of it. We certainly support the designation, even if this wall is not original, if we can make the argument that it does meet code for building and safety reasons, even if it doesn't quite meet the zoning code. I'm not sure how that'll play out. So.
One quick, just slight sort of correction on what you said. There was actually one council member who insisted that many changes had been made to this house. This is, again, the comment I'm trying to make. He insisted that many changes had been made to this house. He was looking at something, and in his mind, well, there's so many changes to this house. One council member questioned, well, what changes are you seeing? And that part of the discussion never got vetted out because it then shifted and focused on the wall.
That question I was able to address somewhat because you can't see it in this photo, but over to the left side of the house, there's a wall that was built by the current owner that's kind of a decorative, almost like art wall or something, that was put up to provide privacy between this house and the neighbor. We acknowledge that the ironwork at the entrance here was put up by the current owner. Ironwork down at the garage level, and there's a gate. So, and we were able to say that these things weren't issues for the commission, and that no property comes through. Well, one good thing that I can't remember which property it was, but I was able to get out that pretty much no property comes for Glendale Register that is completely unaltered over the years. There's very often something.
Yeah, it wasn't so much a comment on what you guys presented.
I know.
It was that person's. I'm not sure that council person at the end of this conversation was still convinced that it was not changed drastically. And the second thing was there seemed to be a disagreement between the two council members about whether or not there was something called legal nonconforming. One of the council members insisted that there really is no such thing, and so that also was a little bit concerning to me. So, and take a watch. It was kind of an interesting one.
We'll bring our planning experts.
That's great. Yeah. Please do.
We always do.
Good.
Thank you.
All right. So that is, we got 3 out of 5 with a possible 4th. The Mountain House, we haven't spoken with the owners yet because they've been on vacation. They do, under our ordinance, if a property is denied, we have a 5-year window during which they could reapply. If they were interested and maybe decided to replace those windows before they applied, maybe the issue would be resolved. Certainly council would maybe have a different composition at that point, so we don't know what would happen. No one's taken us up on that as far as I know over the years, but it's definitely a provision in the code. Okay. And then finally I wanted to fill you in on 2 properties that have been kind of troubled histories. And in both cases, I'm going to take full blame for the fact that we have not resolved these issues yet. These are both things that have come to you in our year-end Mills Act roundups. So the first one is 1106 Rosmoyne, which, if you remember, this is the Spanish Colonial Revival house that had pretty bad restuccoing some time ago. And when this came to the commission, the previous owners brought it to the commission, and the commission imposed several Mills Act conditions. The most significant one was to restucco the house, but there was a small list of other conditions, including replace the garage door, replace some ironwork at a balcony, do a little research at the front about whether there had been brick on this house, which we have done. Then the owners, between the time the commission voted to designate, between the time council designated the house and the owners were to sign their Mills Act contract, they realized that they were selling the house. They got cold feet about doing anything, so they did not sign the contract, which would have bound the next owner. It was their decision. The current owner has indicated that he and his wife are interested in pursuing the Mills Act. I have not been able to stay on top of them with regular phone calls reminding them of this, but over the last several years, we have been in contact. I talked with him the other day. He says he still wants to get the Mills Act. I told him the commission's patience was, toward its final nerve, or what I don't know what the term would be. Commission is losing patience. He's going to get back to me he's going to get his quotes in order. He's having trouble getting contractors to respond to his requests for, I think his main thing is to find out how much the stucco work will cost. So the issue is that if the commission gives me permission, I can grant him an extension, and if you want to give me a suggestion of what that would be, and that could be a suggestion about how much time he has to just make his decision about whether he's going to go for the mills or not. If he chooses not to go for the Mills Act, we're going to have to remove this from the Glendale Register. That was our original plan, and the city attorney advised us against doing that. Unfortunately, it would have made things cleaner right now. But if they do the work, this is a lovely house that I think is very eligible for the register. So in terms of the timeline, I think we could ask the applicant to come back, or I could relay at a future meeting, once they find out how much it costs, how much time they would need, and at the commission's discretion, you could decide whether you wanted to grant that extension or suggest that he just withdraw from the Glendale Register. Those would be the two options. So the second, if you have any questions for this?
Well, at our last meeting, we did define deadlines.
Yeah, which I think are well past the
Are they?
deadlines.
I remember a September deadline and a December deadline.
Yeah, I have to go back to the meeting notes, which I didn't do before this, and I that's where I'm taking full blame for that. I have not been able to get on top of it. The Hillcrest house, 1753 Hillcrest, I'm sure you remember. Again, lovely Spanish house. This one had the carport. The condition was to remove the carport and build a new garage. Same thing. We've met and talked about it over time. We've seen some preliminary drawings, but nothing has come to the point where we're ready to move forward to get permits and approvals from building and safety and from planning. I'm meeting with the owners and their architect next week, so I could come back theoretically at the October hearing and relay what we talked about, and again see if the commission is inclined to extend the timeline. Their timeline for construction of the garage was by December 31st, 2017. So we're still within that period, but realistically I don't think that's going to happen. They have fulfilled all their other conditions. There were several wood repairs and a couple of other things that they have done, which I showed you at the last fulfillment.
The carport's still there, or they've removed that?
Carport's still there.
Discussion on deadlines for the last two properties?
Last one seems like it's still within its
Time period.
time period.
But they were supposed to be done.
They're supposed to be completed, yeah. So
Your last time frame, I believe we decided they would have needed to have everything, I think, approved and permitted by June and construction done by December 31st, I thought.
I think that was
or something about
so
that.
we're many months behind.
And this one is already, the Mills Act contract is in effect on this one, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So if they don't meet the deadline and we decide that they have run their course, the whole other mechanism goes into place, correct?
Then
A
we
major
relate to the
fine.
city attorney, and we begin the process. The penalty is so onerous that I know
Huge.
that would. I believe that they're operating in good faith at a slower pace, and had I been able to be more on top of them, I think we would have been in a better position.
I mean, it is
now.
it's a big thing that they're doing. So yeah,
No.
It involves many
And we've
departments.
also their original plan was much grander than the zoning code allows, so they've gone through a few iterations that we have been working with them on. The meeting that we have on Wednesday will be the meeting where we kind of establish, okay, here's your zoning envelope, here's what you can do. It's going to be much more modest, I think, than what they were hoping. Hopefully that will make
it easier,
more cost-effective.
Yeah.
Hopefully it'll make it happen sooner. What I could do is that I could agendize both of these at the October hearing. If you're not comfortable making a deadline, give you updates on what I hear this month. And unless you're inclined, if you want to set some timelines right now, that's fine also.
Really hear what they have to say.
I think we should wait till we have a little more information. Yeah, if you've got a meeting with them, we should see how that goes.
Well, I think because you're meeting with them, you could propose that we have discussed, say, an extension to June 30th, or this is the second extension already, I believe, right?
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah.
For
So I think it would be
no
helpful
rest.
for your meeting to help prompt them to keep things moving, realizing, but again, I don't want to just name that date. Why don't you guys give some feedback? Then they kind of drawings and permits by December, construction done by June.
Yes.
I mean, it seems
Yeah, that
reasonable
makes
after
sense.
this time, but
Okay, for both properties?
you mean the work on the other?
Yeah,
on
what
the
did you say?
Rossmine?
Where did things stand with Rossmine in your mind?
Ross Moyne
Is waiting.
I think the main issue is finding out how much it's going to cost to do the stucco. I think that may play a factor in their decision. And I believe they've been making a good faith effort to find someone to do the work, and they're finding people are so busy that they're not responding.
So there's no pending meeting you have with them like you do with the Hillcrest people?
No, but we've talked, and he's aware that he needs to
Yeah, I mean, that
move on
one's,
this.
and that one's past
Well,
the
I-
deadline.
Maybe
Yeah, I-
March
Also
for that
well
one.
past the
Well, I'm
deadline.
thinking they should probably give you a decision and sign the contract by December. Would that be reasonable? And then we can give them longer time to do the work, because there was quite a few.
That's
Besides
actually-
stucco, there's, like you say, a garage door, that back covered outdoor area, there's the ironwork, so all of those right, we need to give longer extensions for the work.
Yeah, to be honest, I told him that I assumed the commission would want the Mills Act contract signed this year.
Yes.
Yeah.
To do that, we are going to have to you will have to make a decision on any new deadlines.
Okay.
So what I would recommend is that we give him an October deadline to figure out what he wants to do, get
Okay.
his numbers, and make the decision. Bring that back, agendize it for the October 19th hearing,
Okay,
and then you can set whatever deadlines you want, and then we'll write that into the contract.
that sounds good.
That's fine.
I think we talked about it at the prior meeting where this was agendized. There's an incentive to him them making it by October, so they're not missing a whole nother year
Yeah.
potentially of the Mills Act, going to City Council, getting.
Right.
So that would be
Well, you said
helpful
by
to
the
them as well if October is a deadline for them to make a decision and sign the Mills Act.
Yeah, well, October, it's actually December 31st is the deadline to get it recorded, then they get the tax benefit October 2018.
Right, but it takes you a while to.
it's got to
Yeah.
Do
We
paperwork and stuff.
typically process all of the contracts in November.
Okay.
And then get them signed in early December and recorded a week or two before the end of the year, typically.
So in time for our October 19th meeting, how much time would you need to get your final answer from him? Them.
Well, I could get it on the morning of the 19th, I think.
Okay.
So I'm not writing a staff report for this, so it'll just be a discussion item.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'll do is report back to the commission about the timeline for the owner of the house on Ross Moyne, 1106 Ross Moyne, and with the goal of having a Mills Act contract in place by the end of the year, and then you will establish kind of a timeline for the work to be performed. And then for the house, 1753 Hillcrest, we'll have our meeting this week. I will tell them that the commission would like to have permits in place by, do you want to have the December 31st, or would you like that to be brought back for October also?
Well, you'll give us an update either way, right?
Sure,
The
but
October meeting.
if you give me a deadline now, I'll relay that to them
Oh, yeah.
at our meeting.
For their permits?
Yeah.
Yeah, to get their permits in place.
Yeah.
Permitting is an inherently unpredictable process because our staff has to be involved, and so it's
Well, plan check, let's just say, right? It submitted a plan check by the 31st?
of December.
Or you want to submit it earlier so they can have a permit?
Earlier, I wouldn't say because I don't
Oh.
want to put our staff in that pressure. So if we say December 31st, I think that's probably doable for most of my colleagues.
Well, if we're talking about just having them submit for plan
Yeah.
check, that's probably doable, but to get through plan check.
No,
would probably
submit.
take much longer.
Yeah, they
Tech-
submit.
tech-
By
Technically, this,
over the
and then the question is, will the commission want to review the project? A garage can be exempted from design review. This is completely invisible from the street, so it's whether the commission trusts staff to do this as an exemption, which would speed up the process, or if you want to review the work. I don't think we would do this as an administrative review, just because it's been such an issue for the commission, and there wouldn't be much reason to do it that way. But staff is comfortable reviewing it because what I think it's going to be is a simple two-car garage with either a hipped or probably a gabled roof on this house. Actually, they have hips and gables. We might be able to think about it either way.
I think because it's completely, I mean, it cannot be seen from the public right of way at all. I'd be comfortable with letting staff review this one.
I agree.
So the goal will be through the exemption process to have the planning division design review completed by December 31st, which then moves it into plan check, which is a less, I can't say how long that will take. A simple garage, again, I don't think will take that long. And then we could give them a construction deadline of the end of 2018 or fall. Usually we do our deadlines kind of at year end.
I think we should
I
do
can't
it
say how
earlier
long.
because we're bumping into people not getting to their deadlines. That gives us a
I mean,
little
Yeah, I'm
more.
just
Do
thinking.
you think 6 months is not long enough for them to do the project, then give them to September?
I just can't speak to if someone's if they're having legitimate troubles getting a stucco contractor to give a bid for restuccoing an entire house, which seems like the bread and butter of that profession. I just don't know in terms of contractors who's out there. Although
Well, September 30th, is that fair?
that
Yeah.
it's your decision.
Yeah.
So I will relay to them whatever you want. So September 30th deadline for construction, for sign off, for building and safety sign off, we'll say.
No, you said it would go through planning review, but you or your staff will review it since it's historic
Yeah,
register
that's
property.
the planning review. We do
Okay.
design review.
I want to
and
make sure it wasn't
zoning review.
going just planning, but someone from
No.
with historic background.
Yeah, actually, Eileen Babachani, who you remember as
Yes.
our preservation intern, she's now a planning assistant on staff, so she brings her preservation expertise to the work she does, and she's already been assigned to this project. So.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to make sure I wrote this down correctly. We'll move forward through the exemption process unless something turns up. That if they decide they need to do something that requires a variance, I will try to encourage them not to do that, because that adds a lot of time to this. So if we get a code compliant, easy approval, the planning and zoning review will be completed by December 31st. And then the construction will be completed by September 30th. Okay.
Perfect.
As perfect as this kind of thing is.
Exactly.
Any other comments on that, or are we ready for?
I'm